An American Tragedy, continuing on cassette number 11, side 1. After looking at her curiously a moment, as though seeking to recognize someone of the immediate vicinity, the doctor began, "Well, now, who is this, please? And what can I do for you?" His voice was low and quite reassuring, a fact for which Roberta was deeply grateful. At the same time startled by the fact that at last she'd reached the place and the moment when, if ever, she must say the degrading truth about herself, she merely sat there, her eyes first upon him, then upon the floor, her fingers beginning to toy with the handle of the small bag she carried. "You see, well," she began, earnestly and nervously, her whole manner suddenly betraying the terrific strain under which she was laboring. I came, that is, I don't know whether I can tell you about myself or not. I thought I could just before I came in, but now that I'm here and I see you—" She paused and moved back in her chair as though to rise, at the same time that she added, "Oh, dear, how very dreadful it all is. I'm so nervous and—" "Well, now, my dear," he resumed, pleasantly and reassuringly, impressed by her attractive and yet sober appearance, and wondering for the moment what could have upset so clean, modest, and sedate-looking a girl, and hence not a little amused by her, "now that I see you." "Just what is there about me, now that you see me," he repeated after her, "that so frightens you? I'm only a country doctor, you know, and I hope I'm not as dreadful as you seem to think. You can be sure that you can tell me anything you wish, anything at all about yourself, and you needn't be afraid. If there's anything I can do for you, I'll do it." He was decidedly pleasant, as she now thought, and yet so sober and reserved, and probably conventional withal, that what she was holding in mind to tell him would probably shock him not a little. And then what? Would he do anything for her? And if he would, how was she to arrange about money? For that certainly would be a point in connection with all this. If only Clyde or someone was here to speak for her. And yet she must speak now that she was here. She could not leave without. Once more she moved and twisted, seizing nervously on a large button of her coat to turn between her thumb and forefinger, and then went on chokingly, "But this is, well, something different, you know. Maybe not what you think. Well—" Again she paused, unable to proceed, shading from white to red and back as she spoke, and because of the troubled modesty of her approach, as well as a certain clarity of eye, whiteness of forehead, sobriety of manner and dress, the doctor could scarcely bring himself to think for a moment that this was anything other than one of those morbid exhibitions of innocence, or rather inexperience, in connection with everything relating to the human body, so characteristic of the young and unsophisticated in some instances. And so he is about to repeat his customary formula in such cases, that all could be told him without fear or hesitation, whatever it might be, when a secondary thought, based on Roberta's charm and vigor, as well as her own thought waves attacking his cerebral receptive centers, caused him to decide that he might be wrong. After all, why might not this be another of those troublesome youthful cases in which possibly immorality and illegitimacy was involved? She was so young, healthy, and attractive. Besides, there were always cropping up these cases, in connection with the most respectable-looking girls at times, and invariably they spelled trouble and distress for doctors, and for various reasons connected with his own temperament, which was retiring and recessive, as well as the nature of this local social world, he disliked and hesitated to even trifle with them. They were illegal, dangerous, involved little or no pay as a rule, and the sentiment of this local world was all against them, as he knew. Besides, he personally was more or less irritated by these young scamps of boys and girls, who were so free to exercise the normal functions of their natures in the first instance, but so ready to refuse the social obligations which went with them, marriage afterwards. And so, although in several cases in the past 10 years, where family and other neighborhood and religious considerations had made it seem quite advisable, he had assisted in extricating from the consequences of their folly several young girls of good family who had fallen from grace and could not otherwise be rescued, still he was opposed to aiding, either by his own countenance or skill, any lapses or tangles not heavily sponsored by others. It was too dangerous. Ordinarily it was his custom to advise immediate and unconditional marriage, or where that was not possible, the perpetrator of the infamy having decamped, it was his general and self-consciously sanctioned practice to have nothing at all to do with the matter. It was too dangerous and ethically and socially wrong and criminal into the bargain. In consequence, he now looked at Roberta in an extremely sober manner. By no means, he now said to himself, must he allow himself to become emotionally or otherwise involved here. And so, in order to help himself as well as her to attain and maintain a balance which would permit of both extricating themselves without too much trouble, he drew toward him his black leather-cased record book, and opening it said, "Now, let's see if we can't find out what the trouble is here. What is your name?" "Ruth Howard." "Mrs. Howard," replied Roberta, nervously and tensely, at once fixing upon a name which Clyde had suggested for her use. And now, interestingly enough, at mention of the fact that she was married, he breathed easier. But why the tears, then? What reason could a young married woman have for being so intensely shy and nervous? "And your husband's first name?" he went on. As simple as the question was, and as easy as it should have been to answer, Roberta nevertheless hesitated before she could bring herself to say, "Gifford," her older brother's name. "You live around here, I presume?" "In Fonda." "Yes. And how old are you?" 22. "How long have you been married?" This inquiry being so intimately connected with the problem before her, she again hesitated before saying, "Let me see, 3 months." At once Dr. Glenn became dubious again, though he gave her no sign. Her hesitancy arrested him. Why the uncertainty? He was wondering now again whether he was dealing with a truthful girl, or whether his first suspicions were being substantiated. In consequence, he now asked, "Well, now what seems to be the trouble, Mrs. Howard? You need have no hesitancy in telling me, none whatsoever. I'm used to such things year in and out, whatever they are. That is my business, listening to the troubles of people." "Well," began Roberta, nervously once more, this terrible confession drying her throat and thickening her tongue almost, while once more she turned the same button of her coat and gazed at the floor. "It's like this, you see. My husband hasn't much money, and I have to work to help out with expenses, and neither of us makes so very much." She was astonishing herself with her own shameful power to lie in this instance, she who had always hated to lie. "So, of course, we can't afford to have, well, any children, you see, so soon, anyhow, and—" She paused, her breath catching, and really unable to proceed further with this wholesale lying. The doctor, realizing from this as he thought what the true problem was, that she was a newly married girl who was probably faced by just such a problem as she was attempting to outline, yet not wishing to enter upon any form of malpractice, and at the same time not wishing to appear too discouraging to a young couple just starting out in life, gazed at her somewhat more sympathetically. The decidedly unfortunate predicament of these young people, as well as her appropriate modesty in the face of such a conventionally delicate situation, appealing to him. It was too bad. Young people these days did have a rather hard time of it, getting started in some cases anyhow, and they were no doubt faced by some pressing financial situations. Nearly all young people were. Nevertheless, this business of a contraceptal operation or interference with the normal or God-arranged life processes, well, that was a ticklish and unnatural business at best, which he wanted as little as possible to do with. Besides, young healthy people, even though poor, when they undertook marriage, knew what they were about, and it was not impossible for them to work, the husband anyhow, and hence managed in some way. And now, straightening himself around in his chair very soberly and authoritatively, he began, "I think I understand what you want to say to me, Mrs. Howard. But I'm also wondering if you considered what a very serious and dangerous thing it is you have in mind. But," he added suddenly, another thought as to whether his own reputation in this community was in any way being tarnished by rumor of anything he'd done in the past coming to him, "just how did you happen to come to me, anyhow?" Something about the tone of his voice, the manner in which he asked the question, the caution of it as well as the possibly impending resentment, in case it should turn out that anyone suspected him of a practice of this sort, caused Roberta to hesitate, and to feel that any statement to the effect that she had heard of or been sent by anyone else, Clyde to the contrary notwithstanding, might be dangerous. Perhaps she'd better not say that she'd been sent by anyone. He might resent it as an insult to his character as a reputable physician. A budding instinct for diplomacy helped her in this instance, and she replied, "I've noticed your sign in passing several times, and I've heard different people say you were a good doctor." His uncertainty allayed, he now continued, "In the first place, the thing you want done is something my conscience would not permit me to advise. I understand, of course, that you consider it necessary. You and your husband are both young, and you probably haven't very much money to go on, and you both feel that an interruption of this kind will be a great strain in every way, and no doubt it will be. Still, as I see it, marriage is a very sacred thing, and children are a blessing, not a curse. And when you went to the altar 3 months ago, you were probably not unaware that you might have to face just such a situation as this. All young married people are, I think." "The altar," thought Roberta sadly. "If only it were so." Now I know that the tendency of the day in some quarters is very much in this direction, I'm sorry to say. There are those who feel it quite all right if they can shirk the normal responsibilities in such cases as to perform these operations. But it's very dangerous, Mrs. Howard. Very dangerous legally and ethically, as well as medically very wrong. Many women who seek to escape childbirth die in this way. Besides, it is a prison offense for any doctor to assist them, whether there are bad consequences or not. You know that, I suppose. At any rate, I, for one, am heartily opposed to this sort of thing from every point of view. The only excuse I've ever been able to see for it is when the life of the mother, for instance, depends upon such an operation, not otherwise, and in such cases the medical profession is in accord. But in this instance I'm sure the situation isn't one which warrants anything like that. You seem to me to be a strong, healthy girl. Motherhood should hold no serious consequences for you. And as for money reasons, don't you really think now that if you just go ahead and have this baby, you and your husband would find means of getting along? You say your husband is an electrician?" "Yes," replied Roberta nervously, not a little overawed and subdued by a solemn moralizing. "Well, now there you are," he went on. "That's not such an unprofitable profession. At least all electricians charge enough. And when you consider, as you must, how serious a thing you're thinking of doing, that you're actually planning to destroy a young life that has as good a right to its existence as you have to yours." He paused in order to let the substance of what he was saying sink in. "Well, then, I think you might feel called upon to stop and consider, both you and your husband. Besides," he added, in a diplomatic and more fatherly and even intriguing tone of voice, "I think that once you have it, it will more than make up to you both for whatever little hardship its coming will bring you. Tell me," he added curiously at this point, "does your husband know of this, or is this just some plan of yours to save him and yourself from too much hardship?" He almost beamed cheerfully, as fancying he had captured Roberta in some purely nervous and feminine economy as well as dread. He decided that if so, he could easily extract her from her present mood, and she, sensing his present drift, and feeling that one lie more or less could neither help nor harm her, replied quickly, "He knows." "Well, then," he went on, slightly reduced by the fact that his surmise was incorrect, but none the less resolved to dissuade her and him too, "I think you two should really consider very seriously before you go further in this matter. I know when young people first face a situation like this, they always look on the darkest side of it, but it doesn't always work out that way. I know my wife and I did with our first child, but we got along, and if you'll only stop now and talk it over, you'll see it in a different light, I'm sure. And then you won't have your conscience to deal with afterwards either." He ceased, feeling reasonably sure that he had dispelled the fear, as well as the determination that had brought Roberta to him. That, being a sensible, ordinary wife, she would now desist, of course, think nothing more of her plan, and leave. But instead of either acquiescing cheerfully or rising to go, as he thought she might, she gave him a wide-eyed, terrified look, and then as instantly burst into tears, for the total effect of his address had been to first revive more clearly than ever the normal social or conventional aspect of the situation, which all along she was attempting to shut out from her thoughts, and which, under ordinary circumstances, assuming that she was really married, was exactly the attitude she would have taken. But now the realization that her problem was not to be solved at all, by this man at least, caused her to be seized with what might best be described as morbid panic. Suddenly beginning to open and shut her fingers, and at the same time beating her knees, while her face contorted itself with pain and terror, she exclaimed, "But you don't understand, Doctor. You don't understand. I have to get out of this in some way. I have to. It isn't like I told you at all. I'm not married. I haven't any husband at all. But oh, you don't know what this means to me. My family, my father, my mother. I can't tell you. But I must get out of it. I must. Oh, you don't know. You don't know. I must. She began to rock backward and forward, at the same time swaying from side to side as in a trance. And Glenn, surprised and startled by the sudden demonstration, as well as emotionally affected, and yet at the same time advised thereby that his original surmise had been correct, and hence that Roberta had been lying, as well as that if he wished to keep himself out of this, he must now assume a firm and even heartless attitude, asked solemnly, "You're not married, you say?" For answer now Roberta merely shook her head negatively and continued to cry. And at last, gathering the full import of her situation, Dr. Glenn got up, his face a study of troubled and yet conservative caution and sympathy. But without saying anything at first, he merely looked at her as she wept. Later he added, Well, this is too bad. I'm sorry." But fearing to commit himself in any way, he merely paused, adding after a time soothingly and dubiously, "You mustn't cry. That won't help you any." He then paused again, still determined not to have anything to do with this case. Yet a bit curious as to the true nature of the story, he finally asked, "Well, then where is the young man who is the cause of your trouble? Is he here?" Still too overcome by shame and despair to speak, Roberta merely shook her head negatively. "But he knows that you're in trouble, doesn't he?" "Yes," replied Roberta faintly. "And he won't marry you?" "He's gone away." "Oh, I see, the young scamp. And don't you know where he's gone?" "No," lied Roberta weakly. "How long has it been since he left you?" "About a week now." Once more she lied. "And you don't know where he is?" "No." "How long has it been since you were sick?" "Over 2 weeks now," sobbed Roberta. "And before that you've always been regular?" "Yes." Well, in the first place, his tone was more comfortable and pleasant than before. He seemed to be snatching at a plausible excuse for extricating himself from a case which promised little other than danger and difficulty. "This may not be as serious as you think. I know you're probably very much frightened, but it's not unusual for women to miss a period. At any rate, without an examination it wouldn't be possible to be sure, and even if you were, the most advisable thing would be to wait another 2 weeks. You may find then that there's nothing wrong. I wouldn't be surprised if you did. You seem to be oversensitive and nervous, and that sometimes brings about delays of this kind, mere nervousness. At any rate, if you'll take my advice, whatever you do, you'll not do anything now, but just go home and wait until you're really sure. Or even if anything were to be done, it wouldn't be advisable for you to do anything before then." "But I've already taken some pills, and they haven't helped me," pleaded Roberta. "What were they?" asked Glenn interestedly. And after he'd learned, merely commented, "Oh, those. Well, they won't be likely to be of any real service to you if you were pregnant. But I still suggest that you wait, and if you find you pass your second period, then it will be time enough to act, although I earnestly advise you even then to do nothing if you can help it, because I consider it wrong to interfere with nature in this way. It would be much better if you would arrange to have the child and take care of it. Then you wouldn't have the additional sin of destroying a life upon your conscience." He was very grave and felt very righteous as he said this. But Roberta, faced by terrors which he did not appear to be able to grasp, merely exclaimed, and as dramatically as before, "But I can't do that, Doctor, I tell you. I can't. You don't understand. Oh, I don't know what I shall do unless I find some way out of this. I don't. She shook her head and clenched her fingers and rocked to and fro, while Glenn, Impressed by her own terrors, the pity of the folly which, as he saw it, had led her to this dreadful pass, yet professionally alienated by a type of case that spelled nothing but difficulty for him, stood determinedly before her and added, "As I told you before, miss—" He paused. "Howard, if that is your name, I am seriously opposed to operations of this kind, just as I am to the folly that brings girls and young men to the point where they seem to think they are necessary. A physician may not interfere in a case of this kind, unless he is willing to spend 10 years in prison, and I think that law is fair enough. Not that I don't realize how painful your present situation appears to you, but there are always those who are willing to help a girl in your state, providing she doesn't wish to do something which is morally and legally wrong. And so the very best advice I can give you now is that you do nothing at all now or at any time. Better go home and see your parents and confess. It will be much better, I assure you. Not nearly as hard as you think or as wicked as this other way. Don't forget there's a life there, a human, if it is really as you think, a human life which you're seeking to end, and that I cannot help you to do. I really cannot. There may be doctors, I know there are, men here and there who take their professional ethics a little less seriously than I do, but I cannot let myself become one of them. I'm sorry. Very. So now the best I can say is go home to your parents and tell them. It may look hard now, but you're going to feel better about it in the long run. If it will make you or them feel any better about it, let them come and talk to me. I will try and make them see that this is not the worst thing in the world, either. But as for doing what you want, I'm very, very sorry, but I cannot. My conscience will not permit me." He paused and gazed at her sympathetically, yet with a determined and concluded look in his eye, and Roberta, dumbfounded by this sudden termination of all her hopes in connection with him, and realizing at last that not only had she been misled by Clyde's information in regard to this doctor, but that her technical as well as emotional plea had failed, now walked unsteadily to the door, the terrors of the future crowding thick upon her. And once outside in the dark, after the doctor had most courteously and ruefully closed the door behind her, she paused to lean against a tree that was there, her nervous and physical strength all but failing her. He had refused to help her. He had refused to help her. And now what? Chapter 38. The first effect of the doctor's decision was to shock and terrify them both, Roberta and Clyde, beyond measure. For apparently now here was illegitimacy and disgrace for Roberta, exposure and destruction for Clyde, and this had been their one solution, seemingly. Then, by degrees, for Clyde at least, there was a slight lifting of the heavy pall. Perhaps, after all, as the doctor had suggested, and once she'd recovered her senses sufficiently to talk, she told him, the end had not been reached. There was the bare possibility, as suggested by the druggist, Short, and the doctor, that she might be mistaken, and this, while not producing a happy reaction in her, had the unsatisfactory result of inducing in Clyde a lethargy based more than anything else on the ever-haunting fear of inability to cope with this situation, as well as the certainty of social exposure in case he did not, which caused him, instead of struggling all the more desperately, to defer further immediate action. For such was his nature that, although he realized clearly the probable tragic consequences if he did not act, still it was so hard to think to whom else to apply to without danger to himself. To think that the doctor had turned her down, as he phrased it, and that Short's advice should have been worth as little as that. But apart from nervous thoughts as to whom to turn to next, no particular individual occurred to him before the 2 weeks were gone or after. It was so hard to just ask anywhere. One just couldn't do it. Besides, of whom could he ask now? Of whom? These things took time, didn't they? Yet in the meantime, the days going by, both he and Roberta had ample time to consider what, if any, steps they must take, the one in regard to the other, in case no medical or surgical solution was found. For Roberta, while urging and urging, if not so much by words as by expression and mood at her work, was determined that she must not be left to fight this out alone. She could not be. On the other hand, as she could see, Clyde did nothing, for apart from what he had already attempted to do, he was absolutely at a loss how to proceed. He had no intimates, and in consequence he could only think of presenting the problem as an imaginary one to one individual and another here or there, in the hope of extracting some helpful information. At the same time, and as impractical and evasive as it may seem, there was the call of that diverting world of which Sandra was a part, evenings and Sundays, when, in spite of Roberta's wretched state and mood, he was called to go here and there, and did, because in doing so he was actually relieving his own mind of the dread spectre of disaster that was almost constantly before it. If only he could get her out of this! If only he could! But how, without money, intimates, a more familiar understanding of the medical, or if not that exactly, than the sub-rosa world of sexual Freemasonry which some at times, the bellhops of the Green Davidsons for instance, seemed to understand? He'd written to Ratter, of course, but there had been no answer, since Ratter had removed to Florida, and as yet Clyde's letter had not reached him. And locally all those he knew best were either connected with a factory or society, individuals on the one hand too inexperienced or dangerous, or on the other hand too remote and dangerous, since he was not sufficiently intimate with any of them as yet to command their true confidence and secrecy. At the same time he must do something. He could not just rest and drift. Assuredly Roberta could not long permit him to do that, faced as she was by exposure, and so from time to time he actually racked himself, seized upon straws, and what would have been looked upon by most as forlorn chances. Thus, for instance, an associate foreman, chancing to reminisce one day concerning a certain girl in his department who had gotten in trouble and had been compelled to leave, he'd been given the opportunity to inquire what he thought such a girl did in case she could not afford or did not want to have a child. But this particular foreman, being as uninformed as himself, merely observed that she probably had to see a doctor if she knew one, or go through with it, which left Clyde exactly where he was. On another occasion, in connection with a conversation in a barber shop, relating to a local case reported in the Star, where a girl was suing a local ne'er-do-well for breach of promise, the remark was made that she would never have sued that guy, you bet, unless she had to. Whereupon Clyde seized the opportunity to remark hopefully, "But wouldn't you think that she could find some way of getting out of trouble without marrying a fellow she didn't like?" "Well, that's not so easy as you may think, particularly around here," elucidated the wiseacre who was trimming his hair. "In the first place, it's agin the law, and next it takes a lot of money, and in case you ain't got it, well, money makes the mare go, you know." He snipped with his scissors, while Clyde, confronted by his own problem, meditated on how true it was. If he had a lot of money, even a few $100s, he might take it now and possibly persuade her, who could tell, to go somewhere by herself and have an operation performed. Yet each day, as on the one before, he was saying to himself that he must find someone, and Roberta was saying to herself that she too must act, must not really depend on Clyde any longer if he were going to act so. One could not trifle or compromise with a terror of this kind. It was a cruel imposition on her. It must be that Clyde did not realize how terribly this affected her and even him, or certainly, if he were not going to help her out of it, as he had distinctly said he would do at first, then decidedly she could not be expected to weather the subsequent storm alone. Never, never, never. For after all, as Roberta saw it, Clyde was a man. He had a good position. It was not he, but she, who was in this treacherous position, and unable to extricate herself alone. And beginning with the second day after the second period, when she discovered for once and all that her worst suspicions were true, she not only emphasized the fact in every way that she could that she was distressed beyond all words, but on the third day announced to him in a note that she was again going to see the doctor near Gloversville that evening, regardless of his previous refusal, so great was her need, and also asking Clyde whether he would accompany her, a request which, since he'd not succeeded in doing anything, and although he had an engagement with Sandra, he instantly acceded to, feeling it to be of greater importance than anything else. He must excuse himself to Sandra on the ground of work. And accordingly this second trip was made, a long and nervous conversation between himself and Roberta on the way, resulting in nothing more than some explanations as to why thus far he had not been able to achieve anything, plus certain encomiums addressed to her concerning her courage in acting for herself in this way. Yet the doctor again would not and did not act. After waiting nearly an hour for his return from somewhere, she was merely permitted to tell him of her unchanged state and her destroying fears in regard to herself, but with no hint from him that he could be induced to act as indeed he could act. It was against his prejudices and ethics. And so once more Roberta returned, this time not crying, actually too sad to cry, choked with the weight of her impending danger, and the anticipatory fears and miseries that attended it. And Clyde, hearing of this defeat, was at last reduced to a nervous, gloomy silence, absolutely devoid of a helpful suggestion. He could not think what to say, and was chiefly fearful lest Roberta now make some demand with which socially or economically he could not comply. However, in regard to this she said little on the way home. Instead she sat and stared out of the window, thinking of her defenseless predicament that was becoming more real and terrible to her hourly. By way of excuse she pleaded that she had a headache. She wanted to be alone, only to think more, to try to work out a solution. She must work out some way. That she knew. But what? How? What could she do? How could she possibly escape? She felt like a cornered animal fighting for its life with all odds against it, and she thought of 1,000 remote and entirely impossible avenues of escape, only to return to the one and only safe and sound solution that she really felt should be possible, and that was marriage. And why not? Hadn't she given him all, and that against her better judgment? Hadn't he over-persuaded her? Who was he anyway to so cast her aside? For decidedly at times, and especially since this latest crisis had developed, his manner, because of Sandra and the Griffiths, and what he felt to be the fatal effect of all this on his dreams here, was sufficient to make plain that love was decidedly dead, and that he was not thinking nearly so much of the meaning of her state to her, as he was of its import to him, the injury that was most certain to accrue to him. And when this did not completely terrify her, as mostly it did, it served to irritate and slowly develop the conclusion that in such a desperate state as this, she was justified in asking more than ordinarily she would have dreamed of asking, marriage itself, since there was no other door. And why not? Wasn't her life as good as his, and hadn't he joined his to hers voluntarily? Then why shouldn't he strive to help her now, or, failing that, make this final sacrifice, which was the only one by which she could be rescued apparently? Or who were all the society people with whom he was concerned anyhow? And why should he ask her in such a crisis to sacrifice herself, her future and good name, just because of his interest in them? They had never done anything very much for him, certainly not as much as had she, and just because he was wearying now, after persuading her to do his bidding, was that any reason why now, in this crisis, he should be permitted to desert her? After all, wouldn't all of these society people in whom he was so much interested feel that whatever his relationship to them, she would be justified in taking the course which she might be compelled to take? She brooded on this much, more especially on the return from the second attempt to induce Dr. Glenn to help her. In fact, at moments her face took on a defiant, determined look, which was seemingly new to her, but which only developed suddenly under such pressure. Her jaw became a trifle set. She'd made a decision. He would have to marry her. She must make him, if there were no other way out of this. She must. She must. Think of her home, her mother, Grace Marr, the Newtons, all who knew her, in fact. The terror and pain and shame with which this would sear all those in any way identified with her. Her father, brothers, sisters. Impossible. Impossible. It must not and could not be. Impossible. It might seem a little severe to her, even now, to have to insist on this, considering all the emphasis Clyde had hitherto laid upon his prospects here. But how? How else was she to do? Accordingly, the next day, and not a little to his surprise, since for so many hours the night before they'd been together, Clyde received another note telling him that he must come again that night. She had something to say to him, and there was something in the tone of the note that seemed to indicate or suggest a kind of defiance of a refusal of any kind, hitherto absent in any of her communications to him. And at once the thought that this situation, unless cleared away, was certain to prove disastrous, so weighed upon him that he could not but put the best face possible on it and consent to go, and hear what it was that she had to offer in the way of a solution, or, on the other hand, of what she had to complain. Going to her room at a late hour, he found her in what seemed to him a more composed frame of mind than at any time since this difficulty had appeared, a state which surprised him a little, since he had expected to find her in tears. But now, if anything, she appeared more complacent, her nervous thoughts as to how to bring about a satisfactory conclusion for herself having called into play a native shrewdness which was now seeking to exercise itself. And so, directly before announcing what was in her mind, she began by asking, "You haven't found out about another doctor, have you, Clyde? Or thought of anything?" "No, I haven't, Bert," he replied most dismally and wearisomely, his own mental tether length having been strained to the breaking point. "I've been trying to, as you know, but it's so darn hard to find anyone who isn't afraid to monkey with a case like this. Honest, to tell the truth, Bert, I'm about stumped. I don't know what we're going to do unless you can think of something. You haven't thought or heard of anyone else you could go to, have you?" For during the conversation that had immediately followed her first visit to the doctor, he'd hinted to her that by striking up a fairly intimate relationship with one of the foreign family girls, she might by degrees extract some information there which would be of use to both. But Roberta was not of a temperament that permitted of any such facile friendships, and nothing had come of it. However, his stating that he was stumped now gave her the opportunity she was really desiring to present the proposition which she felt to be unavoidable, and not longer to be delayed. Yet, being fearful of how Clyde would react, she hesitated as to the form in which she would present it, and after shaking her head and manifesting a nervousness which was real enough, she finally said, "Well, I'll tell you, Clyde. I've been thinking about it, and I don't see any way out of it unless you, well, marry me. It's 2 months now, you know, and unless we get married right away, everybody'll know, won't they?" Her manner as she said this was a mixture of outward courage born out of her conviction that she was in the right, and an inward uncertainty about Clyde's attitude, which was all the more fused by a sudden look of surprise, resentment, uncertainty, and fear, that now transformation-wise played over his countenance, a variation in play which, if it indicated anything definite, indicated that she was seeking to inflict an unwarranted injury on him. For since he'd been drawing closer and closer to Sandra, his hopes had heightened so intensely that, hearkening to this demand on the part of Roberta now, his brow wrinkled, and his manner changed from one of comparatively affable, if nervous, consideration to that of mingled fear, opposition, as well as determination to evade drastic consequence. For this would spell complete ruin for him, the loss of Sandra, his job, his social hopes and ambitions in connection with the Griffiths, all, a thought which sickened and at the same time caused him to hesitate about how to proceed. But he would not. He would not. He would not do this. Never, never, never. Yet after a moment he exclaimed equivocally, "Well, gee, that's all right too, Bert, for you, because that fixes everything without any trouble at all. But what about me? You don't want to forget that that isn't going to be easy for me the way things are now. You know I haven't any money. All I have is my job. And besides, the family don't know anything about you yet. Not a thing. And if it should suddenly come out now that we've been going together all this time, and that this has happened, and that I was going to have to get married right away, well, gee, they'll know I've been fooling 'em, and they're sure to get sore. And then what? They might even fire me." He paused to see what effect this explanation would have, but noting the somewhat dubious expression which of late characterized Roberta's face whenever he began excusing himself, he added hopefully and evasively, seeking by any trick that he could to delay this sudden issue, "Besides, I'm not so sure that I can't find a doctor yet, either. I haven't had much luck so far, but that's not saying that I won't. And there's a little time yet, isn't there? Sure there is. It's all right up to 3 months anyway." He'd since had a letter from Ratterer who had commented on this fact, and I did hear something the other day of a doctor over in Albany who might do it. Anyway, I thought I'd go over and see before I said anything about him. His manner when he said this was so equivocal that Roberta could tell he was merely lying to gain time. There was no doctor in Albany. Besides, it was so plain that he resented her suggestion and was only thinking of some way of escaping it. And she knew well enough that at no time had he said directly that he would marry her, and while she might urge, in the last analysis, she could not force him to do anything. He might just go away alone, as he'd once said in connection with inadvertently losing his job because of her, and how much greater might not his impulse in that direction now be, if this world here in which he was so much interested were taken away from him, and he were to face the necessity of taking her and a child too. It made her more cautious, and caused her to modify her first impulse to speak out definitely and forcefully, however great her necessity might be. And so disturbed was he by the panorama of the bright world of which Sandra was the center, and which was now at stake, that he could scarcely think clearly. Should he lose all this for such a world as he and Roberta could provide for themselves? A small home, a baby, such a routine workaday life as taking care of her and a baby on such a salary as he could earn, and from which most likely he would never again be freed? God! A sense of nausea seized him. He could not and would not do this, and yet, as he now saw, all his dreams could be so easily tumbled about his ears by her, and because of one false step on his part. It made him cautious, and for the first time in his life caused tact and cunning to visualize itself as a profound necessity. And at the same time Clyde was sensing inwardly, and somewhat shamefacedly, all of this profound change in himself. But Roberta was saying, "Oh, I know, Clyde. But you yourself said just now that you were stumped, didn't you? And every day that goes by just makes it so much the worse for me, if we're not going to be able to get a doctor. You can't get married and have a child born within a few months. You know that. Everyone in the world would know. Besides, I have myself to consider as well as you know. And the baby, too." At the mere mention of a coming child, Clyde winced and recoiled as though he'd been slapped. She noted it. "I just must do one of two things right away, Clyde. Get married or get out of this, and you don't seem to be able to get me out of it, do you? If you're so afraid of what your uncle might think or do in case we get married," she added nervously and yet suavely, "why couldn't we get married right away, and then keep it a secret for a while, as long as we could, or as long as you thought we ought to?" she added shrewdly. "Meanwhile, I could go home and tell my parents about it, that I'm married, but that it must be kept a secret for a while. Then when the time came, when things got so bad that we couldn't stay here any longer without telling, why, we could either go away somewhere if we wanted to, that is, if you didn't want your uncle to know, or we could just announce that we were married some time ago. Lots of young couples do that nowadays. And as for getting along," she went on, noting a sudden dour shadow that passed over Clyde's face like a cloud, "why, we could always find something to do. I know I could anyhow, once the baby's born." When first she began to speak, Clyde had seated himself on the edge of the bed, listening nervously and dubiously to all she had to offer. However, when she came to that part which related to marriage and going away, he got up, an irresistible impulse to move overcoming him, and when she concluded with a commonplace suggestion of going to work as soon as the baby was born, he looked at her with little less than panic in his eyes. To think of marrying and being in a position where it would be necessary to do that, when with a little luck and without interference from her, he might marry Sandra. "Oh, yes, that's all right for you, Bert. That fixes everything up for you. But how about me? Why, gee whiz, I've only got started here now as it is, and I have to pack up and get out, and I would have to, if ever they found out about this. Why, I don't know what I'd do. I haven't any business or trade that I could turn my hand to. It might go hard with both of us. Besides, my uncle gave me this chance because I begged him to, and if I walked off now, he never would do anything for me." In his excitement, he was forgetting that at one time and another in the past he had indicated to Roberta that the state of his own parents was not wholly unprosperous, and that if things did not go just to his liking here, he could return west and perhaps find something to do out there. And it was some general recollection of this that now caused her to ask, "Couldn't we go out to Denver or something like that? Wouldn't your father be willing to help you get something for a time anyhow?" Her tone was very soft and pleading, an attempt to make Clyde feel that things could not be as bad as he was imagining. But the mere mention of his father in connection with all this, the assumption that he, of all people, might prove an escape from drudgery for them both, was a little too much. It showed how dreadfully incomplete was her understanding of his true position in this world. Worse, she was looking for help from that quarter, and not finding it, later might possibly reproach him for that, who could tell, for his lies in connection with it. It made so very clear now the necessity for frustrating, if possible, and that at once, any tendency toward this idea of marriage. It could not be, ever. And yet how was he to oppose this idea with safety, since she felt that she had this claim on him? How say to her openly and coldly that he could not and would not marry her, and unless he did so now, she might think it would be fair and legitimate enough for her to compel him to do so. She might even feel privileged to go to his uncle, his cousin. He could see Gilbert's cold eyes, and expose him. And then destruction, ruin, the end of all his dreams in connection with Sandra and everything else here. But all he could think of saying now was, "But I can't do this, Bert. Not now, anyway." A remark which at once caused Roberta to assume that the idea of marriage, as she had interjected it here, was not one which, under the circumstances, he had the courage to oppose, his saying, "Not now, anyway." Yet, even as she was thinking this, he went swiftly on with, "Besides, I don't want to get married so soon. It means too much to me at this time. In the first place, I'm not old enough, and I haven't got anything to get married on. And I can't leave here. I couldn't do half as well anywhere else. You don't realize what this chance means to me. My father's all right, but he couldn't do what my uncle could, and he wouldn't. You don't know, or you wouldn't ask me to do this." He paused, his face a picture of puzzled fear and opposition. He was not unlike a harried animal, deftly pursued by hunter and hound. But Roberta, imagining that his total defection had been caused by the social side of Lycurgus, as opposed to her own low state, and not because of the superior lure of any particular girl, now retorted resentfully, although she desired not to appear so, "Oh, yes, I know well enough why you can't leave. It isn't your position here, though, half as much as it is those society people you're always running around with. I know. You don't care for me any more, Clyde, that's it. And you don't want to give these other people up for me. I know that's it and nothing else. But just the same, it wasn't so very long ago that you did, although you don't seem to remember it now." Her cheeks burned and her eyes flamed as she said this. She paused a moment, while he gazed at her, wondering about the outcome of all this. "But you can't leave me to make out any way I can, just the same, because I won't be left this way, Clyde. I can't, I tell you." She grew tense and staccato. "It means too much to me. I don't know how to do alone, and I, besides, have no one to turn to but you. And you must help me." End of cassette number 11, side 1. To continue, please turn the cassette over. Cassette number 11, side 2 of An American Tragedy. Roberta continued, "I've got to get out of all this, that's all, Clyde. I've got to. I'm not going to be left to face my people and everybody without any help or marriage or anything." As she said this, her eyes turned appealingly and yet savagely toward him, and she emphasized it all with her hands, which she clinched and unclinched in a dramatic way. "And if you can't help me out in the way you thought," she went on, most agonizedly, as Clyde could see, "then you've got to help me out in this other, that's all. At least until I can do for myself, I just won't be left. I don't ask you to marry me forever," she now added, the thought that if by presenting this demand in some modified form she could induce Clyde to marry her, it might be possible afterwards that his feeling toward her would change to a much more kindly one. "You can leave me after a while if you want to, after I'm out of this. I can't prevent you from doing that, and I wouldn't want to if I could. But you can't leave me now, you can't. Besides," she added, "I didn't want to get myself in this position, and I wouldn't have but for you. But you made me let you come in here, and now you want to leave me to shift for myself, just because you think you won't be able to go in society any more if they find out about me." She paused, the strain of this contest proving almost too much for her tired nerves. At the same time she began to sob nervously and yet not violently, a marked effort at self-restraint and recovery marking her every gesture. And after a moment or two in which both stood there, he gazing dumbly and wondering what else he was to say in answer to all this, she struggling and finally managing to recover her poise, she added, "Oh, what is it about me that's so different to what I was a couple of months ago, Clyde? Will you tell me that? I'd like to know. What is it that has caused you to change so? Up to Christmas almost, you were as nice to me as any human being could be. You were with me nearly all the time you had, and since then I've scarcely had an evening that I didn't beg for. Who is it? What is it? Some other girl or what, I'd like to know? That's Sandra Finchley or Bertine Cranston or who?" Her eyes, as she said this, were a study. Even to this hour, as Clyde could now see to his satisfaction, since he feared the effect on Roberta of definite and absolute knowledge concerning Sandra, she had no specific suspicion, let alone positive knowledge concerning any girl. And coward-wise, in the face of her present predicament and her assumed and threatened claims on him, he was afraid to say what or who the real cause of this change was. Instead, he merely replied, and almost unmoved by her sorrow, since he no longer really cared for her, "Oh, you're all wrong, Bert. You don't see what the trouble is. It's my future here. If I leave here, I certainly will never find such an opportunity. And if I have to marry in this way or leave here, it will all go flooey. I want to wait and get some place first before I marry, see? Save some money, and if I do this, I won't have a chance, and you won't either," he added feebly, forgetting for the moment that up to this time he'd been indicating rather clearly that he did not want to have anything more to do with her in any way. "Besides," he continued, "if you could only find someone, or if you would go away by yourself somewhere for a while, Bert, and go through with this alone, I could send you the money to do it on, I know. I could have it between now and the time you had to go." His face, as he said this, and as Roberta clearly saw, mirrored the complete and resourceless collapse of all his recent plans in regard to her. And she, realizing that his indifference to her had reached the point where he could thus dispose of her and their prospective baby in this casual and really heartless manner, was not only angered in part, but at the same time frightened by the meaning of it all. "Oh, Clyde!" she now exclaimed boldly, and with more courage and defiance than at any time since she'd known him. "How you've changed, and how hard you can be, to want me to go off all by myself and just to save you, so you can stay here and get along and marry someone here when I'm out of the way and you don't have to bother about me any more. Well, I won't do it. It's not fair, and I won't, that's all. I won't. And that's all there is to it. You can get someone to get me out of this, or you can marry me and come away with me, at least long enough for me to have the baby and place myself right before my people and everyone else that knows me. I don't care if you leave me afterwards, because I see now that you really don't care for me any more, and if that's the way you feel, I don't want you any more than you want me. But just the same, you must help me now. You must. But, oh, dear," she began whimpering again, and yet only slightly and bitterly, "to think that all our love for each other should have come to this, that I'm asked to go away by myself, all alone, with no one, while you stay here. Oh, dear, and with a baby on my hands afterwards, and no husband." She clenched her hands and shook her head bleakly. Clyde, realizing well enough that his proposition certainly was cold and indifferent, but in the face of his intense desire for Sandra, the best or at least safest that he could devise, now stood there unable for the moment to think of anything more to say. And although there was some other discussion to the same effect, the conclusion of this very difficult hour was that Clyde had another week or two at best in which to see if he could find a physician or anyone who would assist him. After that, the implied, if not openly expressed threat which lay at the bottom of this was, unless so extricated and speedily, that he would have to marry her, if not permanently, then at least temporarily, but legally just the same, until once again she was able to look after herself. A threat which was as crushing and humiliating to Roberta as it was torturing to him. Chapter 39. Opposing views such as these, especially where no real skill to meet such a situation existed, could only spell greater difficulty and even eventual disaster unless chance in some form should aid. And chance did not aid, and the presence of Roberta in the factory was something that would not permit him to dismiss it from his mind. If only he could persuade her to leave and go somewhere else to live and work, so that he should not always see her, he might then think more calmly. For with her asking continuously, by her presence if no more, what he intended to do, it was impossible for him to think, and the fact that he no longer cared for her as he had tended to reduce his normal consideration of what was her due. He was too infatuated with, and hence disarranged by his thoughts of Sandra. For in the very teeth of this grave dilemma he continued to pursue the enticing dream in connection with Sandra, the dark situation in connection with Roberta seeming no more at moments than a dark cloud which shadowed this other, and hence nightly, for as often as the exigencies of his still unbroken connection with Roberta would permit, he was availing himself of such opportunities as his flourishing connections now afforded. Now, and to his great pride and satisfaction, it was a dinner at the Harriets or Taylors to which he was invited, or a party at the Finchleys or the Cranstons, to which he would either escort Sandra or be animated by the hope of encountering her. And now, also without so many of the former phases or attempts at subterfuge, which had previously characterized her curiosity in regard to him, she was at times openly seeking him out and making opportunities for social contact. And, of course, these contacts, being identical with this typical kind of group gathering, they seemed to have no special significance with the more conservative elders, for although Mrs. Finchley, who was of an especially shrewd and discerning turn socially, had at first been dubious over the attentions being showered upon Clyde by her daughter and others, still observing that Clyde was more and more being entertained, not only in her own home by the group of which her daughter was a part, but elsewhere, everywhere, was at last inclined to imagine that he must be more solidly placed in this world than she'd heard, and later to ask her son and even Sandra concerning him. But receiving from Sandra only the equivocal information that since he was Gil and Bella Griffiths' cousin, and was being taken up by everybody because he was so charming, even if he didn't have any money, she couldn't see why she and Stuart should not be allowed to entertain him also. Her mother rested on that for the time being, only cautioning her daughter under no circumstances to become too friendly. And Sandra, realizing that in part her mother was right, yet being so drawn to Clyde, was now determined to deceive her, at least to the extent of being as clandestinely free with Clyde as she could contrive, and was so much so that everyone who was privy to the intimate contacts between Clyde and Sandra might have reported that the actual understanding between them was assuming an intensity which most certainly would have shocked the elder Finchleys could they have known. For apart from what Clyde had been, and still was dreaming in regard to her, Sandra was truly being taken with thoughts and moods in regard to him, which were fast verging upon the most destroying aspects of the very profound chemistry of love. Indeed, in addition to hand-clasps, kisses, and looks of intense admiration, always bestowed when presumably no one was looking, there were those nebulous and yet strengthening and lengthening fantasies concerning a future which in some way or other, not clear to either as yet, was still always to include each other. Summer days, perhaps, and that soon, in which he and she would be in a canoe at Twelfth Lake, the long shadows of the trees on the bank lengthening over the silvery water, the wind rippling the surface while he paddled, and she idled and tortured him with hints of the future. A certain forest path, grass-sodden and sun-mottled to the south and west of the Cranston and Fant estates, near theirs, through which they might canter in June and July, to a wonderful view known as Inspiration Point, some 7 miles west, the country fair at Sharon, at which, in a gypsy costume, the essence of romance itself, she would superintend a booth, or in her smartest riding habit, give an exhibition of her horsemanship, teas, dances in the afternoon, and in the moonlight, at which, languishing in his arms, their eyes would speak. None of the compulsion of the practical, none of the inhibitions which the dominance and possible future opposition of her parents might imply, just love and summer, and idyllic and happy progress toward an eventual secure and unopposed union which should give him to her forever. And in the meantime, insofar as Roberta was concerned, 2 more long, dreary, terrifying months going by without that meditated action on her part, which must result once it was taken in Clyde's undoing. For as convinced as she was that apart from meditating and thinking of some way to escape his responsibility, Clyde had no real intention of marrying her, still, like Clyde, she drifted, fearing to act really, for in several conferences, following that in which she had indicated that she expected him to marry her, he had reiterated, if vaguely, a veiled threat that in case she appealed to his uncle, he would not be compelled to marry her after all, for he could go elsewhere. The way he put it, it was that unless left undisturbed in his present situation, he would be in no position to marry her, and furthermore could not possibly do anything to aid her at the coming time, when most of all she would stand in need of aid. A hint which caused Roberta to reflect on a hitherto not fully developed vein of hardness in Clyde, although had she but sufficiently reflected, it had shown itself at the time that he compelled her to admit him to her room. In addition, and because she was doing nothing, and yet he feared that at any moment she might, he shifted in part at least from the attitude of complete indifference, which had availed him up to the time that she threatened him, to one of at least simulated interest and goodwill and friendship. For the very precarious condition in which he found himself was sufficiently terrifying to evoke more diplomacy than ever before had characterized him. Besides, he was foolish enough to hope, if not exactly believe, that by once more conducting himself as though he still entertained a lively sense of the problem that afflicted her, and that he was willing, in case no other way was found, to eventually marry her, though he could never definitely be persuaded to commit himself as to this, he could reduce her determination to compel him to act soon, at least to a minimum, and so leave him more time in which to exhaust every possibility of escape without marriage, and without being compelled to run away. And although Roberta sensed the basis of this sudden shift, still she was so utterly alone and distrait that she was willing to give ear to Clyde's mock genial, if not exactly affectionate observations and suggestions. It caused her at his behest to wait a while longer, the while, as he now explained, he would not only have saved up some money, but devised some plan in connection with his work which would permit him to leave for a time anyhow, marry her somewhere, and then establish her and the baby as a lawful married woman somewhere else, while, although he did not explain this just now, he returned to Lycurgus and sent her such aid as he could, but on condition, of course, that never anywhere, unless he gave her permission, must she assert that he'd married her, or point to him in any way as the father of her child. Also, it was understood that she, as she herself had asserted over and over that she would, if only he would do this, marry her, take steps to free herself on the ground of desertion or something, in some place sufficiently removed from Lycurgus for no one to hear, and that within a reasonable time after a marriage to him, although he was not at all satisfied that, assuming that he did marry her, she would. But Clyde, of course, was insincere in regard to all his overtures at this time, and really not concerned as to her sincerity or insincerity, nor did he have any intention of leaving Lycurgus, even for the moderate length of time that her present extrication would require, unless he had to, for that meant that he would be separated from Sandra, and such absence, for whatever period, would most definitely interfere with his plans. And so, on the contrary, he drifted, thinking most idly at times of some possible fake or mock marriage, such as he'd seen in some melodramatic movie, a fake minister and witnesses combining to deceive some simple country girl such as Roberta was not, but at such expense of time, resources, courage, and subtlety, as Clyde himself, after a little reflection, was wise enough to see was beyond him. Again, knowing that, unless some hitherto unforeseen aid should eventuate, he was heading straight toward a disaster which could not much longer be obviated, he even allowed himself to dream that, once the fatal hour was at hand, and Roberta no longer to be put off by any form of subterfuge, was about to expose him, he might even flatly deny that he'd ever held any such relationship with her as then she would be charging, rather that at all times his relationship with her had been that of a department manager to employee, no more, terror, no less. But at the same time, early in May, when Roberta, because of various gestative signs and ailments, was beginning to explain as well as insist to Clyde that by no stretch of the imagination or courage could she be expected to retain her position at the factory or work later than June 1st, because by then the likelihood of the girls there beginning to notice something would be too great for her to endure, Sandra was beginning to explain that not so much later than the 4th or 5th of June, she and her mother and Stuart, together with some servants, would be going to their new lodge at 12th Lake in order to supervise certain installations then being made before the regular season should begin. And after that, not later than the 18th, at which time the Cranstons, the Harriets, and some others would have arrived, including very likely visits from Bella and Myra, he might expect a weekend invitation from the Cranstons, with whom, through Bertine, she would arrange as to this. And after that, the general circumstances proving fairly propitious, there would be, of course, other weekend invitations to the Harriets, Vance, and some others who dwelt there, as well as to the Griffiths at Greenwood, to which place, on account of Bella, he could easily come. And during his 2 weeks' vacation in July, he could either stop at the casino, which was at Pine Point, or perhaps the Cranstons or Harriets, at her suggestion, might choose to invite him. At any rate, as Clyde could see, and with no more than such expenditures as, with a little scrimping during his ordinary working days here, he could provide for, he might see not a little of that lake life of which he'd read so much in the local papers, to say nothing of Sandra at one and another of the lodges, the masters of which were not so inimical to his presence and overtures as were Sandra's parents. For now it was, and for the first time, as she proceeded to explain to him, that her mother and father, because of his continued and reported attentions to her, were already beginning to talk of an extended European tour, which might keep her and Stuart and her mother abroad for at least the next 2 years. But since, at news of this, Clyde's face fell as well as his spirits darkened, and she herself was sufficiently enmeshed to suffer because of this, she at once added that he must not feel so bad. He must not. Things would work out well enough, she knew. For at the proper time, and unless between then and now something, her own subtle attack, if not her at present feverish interest in Clyde, should have worked to alter her mother's viewpoint in regard to him, she might be compelled to take some steps of her own in order to frustrate her mother. Just what, she was not willing to say at this time, although to Clyde's overheated imagination it took the form of an elopement and marriage, which could not then be gainsaid by her parents, whatever they might think. And it was true that in a vague and as yet repressed way some such thought was beginning to form in Sandra's mind. For as she now proceeded to explain to Clyde, it was so plain that her mother was attempting to steer in the direction of a purely social match, the one with the youth who had been paying her such marked attention the year before. But because of her present passion for Clyde, as she now gaily declared, it was not easy to see how she was to be made to comply. "The only trouble with me is that I am not of age yet," she here added briskly and slangily. "They've got me there, of course, but I will be by next October, and they can't do very much with me after that, I want to let you know. I can marry the person I want, I guess, and if I can't do it here, well, there are more ways than one to kill a cat." The thought was like some sweet, disarranging poison to Clyde. It fevered and all but betrayed him mentally. If only, it were not for Roberta now, that terrifying and all but insoluble problem. But for that, and the opposition of Sandra's parents, which she was thinking she would be able to overcome, did not heaven itself await him? Sandra, 12th Lake, society, wealth, her love and beauty. He grew not a little wild in thinking of it all. Once he and she were married, what could Sandra's relatives do? What but acquiesce and take them into the glorious bosom of their resplendent home at Lycurgus, or provide for them in some other way? He to no doubt eventually take some place in connection with the Finchley Electric Sweeper Company. And then would he not be the equal, if not the superior, of Gilbert Griffiths himself and all those others who originally had ignored him here? Joint heir with Stuart to all the Finchley means, and with Sandra as the central or crowning jewel to so much sudden and such Aladdin-like splendor. No thought as to how he was to overcome the time between now and October, no serious consideration of the fact that Roberta then and there was demanding that he marry her. He could put her off, he thought, and yet, at the same time, he was painfully and nervously conscious of the fact that at no period in his life before had he been so treacherously poised at the very brink of disaster. It might be his duty, as the world would see it, his mother would say so, to at least extricate Roberta. But in the case of Esther, who'd come to her rescue, her lover, he'd walked off from her without a qualm, and she'd not died. And why, when Roberta was no worse off than his sister had been, why should she seek to destroy him in this way, force him to do something which would be little less than social, artistic, passional, or emotional assassination? And when later, if she would but spare him for this, he could do so much more for her, with Sandra's money, of course. He could not and would not let her do this to him. His life would be ruined. Chapter 40. Two incidents which occurred at this time tended still more to sharpen the contrary points of view holding between Clyde and Roberta. One of these was no more than a glimpse which Roberta had one evening of Clyde pausing at the Central Avenue curb in front of the post office to say a few words to Arabella Stark, who, in a large and impressive-looking car, was waiting for her father, who was still in the Stark building opposite. And Miss Stark, fashionably outfitted according to the season, her world and her own pretentious taste, was effectively posed at the wheel, not only for the benefit of Clyde, but the public in general. And to Roberta, who by now was reduced to the verge of distraction between Clyde's delay and her determination to compel him to act in her behalf, she appeared to be little less than an epitome of all the security, luxury, and freedom from responsibility which so enticed and hence caused Clyde to delay and be as indifferent as possible to the dire state which confronted her. For alas, apart from this claim of her condition, what had she to offer him comparable to all he would be giving up in case he acceded to her request? Nothing. A thought which was far from encouraging. Yet at this moment, contrasting her own wretched and neglected state with that of this Miss Stark, for example, she found herself a prey to an even more complaining and antagonistic mood than had hitherto characterized her. It was not right. It was not fair. For during the several weeks that had passed since last they had discussed this matter, Clyde had scarcely said a word to her at the factory or elsewhere, let alone called upon her at her room, fearing as he did the customary inquiry which he could not satisfy. And this caused her to feel that not only was he neglecting but resenting her most sharply. And yet as she walked home from this trivial and fairly representative scene, her heart was not nearly so angry as it was sad and sore, because of the love and comfort that had vanished, and was not likely ever to come again. Ever, ever, ever. Oh, how terrible! How terrible! On the other hand, Clyde, and at approximately the same time, was called upon to witness a scene identified with Roberta, which, as some might think, only an ironic and even malicious fate could have intended or permitted to come to pass. For motoring north the following Sunday to Arrow Lake, to the lodge of the Trumples, to take advantage of an early spring weekend planned by Sandra, the party, on nearing Bouts, which was in the direct line of the trip, was compelled to detour east in the direction of Roberta's home, and coming finally to a north and south road, which ran directly from Triplettsville past the Alden farm, they turned north into that, and a few minutes later came directly to the corner adjoining the Alden farm, where an east and west road led to Bouts. Here Tracy Trumbull, driving at the time, requested that someone should get out and inquire at the adjacent farmhouse as to whether this road did lead to Bouts, and Clyde, being nearest to one door, jumped out, and then, glancing at the name on the mailbox which stood at the junction, and evidently belonged to the extremely dilapidated old farmhouse on the rise above, was a little astonished to note that the name was that of Titus Alden, Roberta's father. Also, as it instantly came to him, since she had described her parents as being near Bouts, this must be her home. It gave him pause, caused him for the moment to hesitate as to whether to go on or not. For once he'd given Roberta a small picture of himself, and she might have shown it up here. Again, the mere identification of this lorn, dilapidated realm with Roberta and hence himself was sufficient to cause him to wish to turn and run. But Sandra, who was sitting next to him in the car, and now noting his hesitation, called, "What's the matter, Clyde? Afraid of the bow-wow?" And he, realizing instantly that they would comment further on his actions if he did not proceed at once, started up the path. But the effect of this house, once he contemplated it thoroughly, was sufficient to arouse in his brain the most troubled and miserable of thoughts. For what a house, to be sure, so lonely and bare, even in this bright spring weather. The decayed and sagging roof, the broken chimney to the north, rough lumps of cemented fieldstones lying at its base, the sagging and semi-toppling chimney to the south, sustained in place by a log chain, the unkempt path from the road below, which slowly he ascended. He was not a little dejected by the broken and displaced stones which served as steps before the front door, and the unpainted, dilapidated outbuildings, all the more dreary because of these others. Gee, to think that this was Roberta's home, and to think, in the face of all that he now aspired to in connection with Sandra and the social group at Lycurgus, she should be demanding that he marry her, and Sandra in the car with him here to see, if not know. The poverty, The reduced grimness of it all. How far he travelled away from just such a beginning as this. With a weakening and sickening sensation at the pit of his stomach, as of some blow administered there, he now approached the door. And then, as if to further distress him, if that were possible, the door was opened by Titus Alden, who, in an old threadbare and out-at-elbows coat, as well as baggy worn jean trousers and rough, shineless, ill-fitting country shoes, desired by his look to know what he wanted, and Clyde, being taken aback by the clothes, as well as a marked resemblance to Roberta about the eyes and mouth, now as swiftly as possible asked if the east and west road below ran through Bilt's and joined the main highway north. And although he would have preferred a quick yes, so that he might have turned and gone, Titus preferred to step down into the yard, and then, with a gesture of the arm, indicate that if they wanted to strike a really good part of the road, they'd better follow this Trippisville north and south road for at least 2 more miles and then turn west. Clyde thanked him briefly, and turned almost before he'd finished and hurried away. For as he now recalled, and with an enormous sense of depression, Roberta was thinking him at this very time, that soon now, and in the face of all Lycurgus had to offer him, Sandra, the coming spring and summer, the love and romance, gaiety, position, power, he was going to give all that up and go away with and marry her. Sneak away to some out-of-the-way place. Oh, how horrible! And with a child at his age. Oh, why had he ever been so foolish and weak as to identify himself with her in this intimate way? Just because of a few lonely evenings? Oh, why couldn't he have waited? And then this other world would have opened up to him just the same. If only he could have waited. And now, unquestionably, unless he could speedily and easily disengage himself from her, all this other splendid recognition would be destined to be withdrawn from him, and this other world from which he sprang might extend its gloomy, poverty-stricken arms to him and envelop him once more, just as the poverty of his family had enveloped and almost strangled him from the first. And it even occurred to him in a vague way for the first time how strange it was that this girl and he, whose origin had been strikingly similar, should have been so drawn to each other in the beginning. Why should it have been? How strange life was, anyway. But even more harrowing than this was the problem of a way out that was before him, and his mind from now on this trip was once more searching for some solution, a word of complaint from Roberta or her parents to his uncle or Gilbert, and assuredly he would be done for. The thought so troubled him that once in the car, and although previously he had been chattering along with the others about what might be in store ahead in the way of divertisement, he now sat silent, and Sandra, who sat next to him, and who previously had been whispering at intervals of her plans for the summer, now, instead of resuming the patter, whispered, "What come over this sweet thing?" When Clyde appeared to be the least reduced in mind, she most affected this patter with him, since it had an almost electric, if sweetly tormenting effect on him. His baby-talking girl, he sometimes called her. Facey all dark now. Little while ago Facey all smiles. Come, make Facey all nice again. Smile at Sandra. Squeeze Sandra's arm like good boy Clyde. She turned and looked up into his eyes to see what, if any, effect this baby-worded cajolery was having, and Clyde did his best to brighten, of course. But even so, and in the face of all this amazingly wonderful love on her part for him, the spectre of Roberta, and all that she represented, now in connection with all this, was ever before him. Her state, her very recent edict in regard to it, the obvious impossibility of doing anything now but go away with her. Why, rather than let himself in for a thing like that, would it not be better, and even though he lost Sandra once and for all, for him to decamp, as in the instance of the slain child in Kansas City, and be heard of never more here? But then he would lose Sandra, his connections here, and his uncle, this world. The loss, the misery of once more drifting about here and there, of being compelled to write his mother once more concerning certain things about his flight, which someone writing from here might explain to her afterwards, and so much more damagingly, and the thoughts concerning him on the part of his relatives. And of late he'd been writing his mother that he was doing so well. What was it about his life that made things like this happen to him? Was this what his life was to be like, running away from one situation and another just to start all over somewhere else, perhaps only to be compelled to flee from something worse. No, he could not run away again. He must face it and solve it in some way. He must. God. Chapter 41. The 5th of June arriving, the Finchleys departed as Sandra had indicated, but not without a most urgent request from her that he be prepared to come to the Cranstons either the 2nd or 3rd weekend following, she to advise him definitely later, a departure which so affected Clyde that he could scarcely think what to do with himself in her absence, depressed as he was by the tangle which Roberta's condition presented. And exactly at this time also, Roberta's fears and demands had become so urgent that it was really no longer possible for him to assure her that if she would but wait a little while longer, he would be prepared to act in her behalf. Plead as he might, her case, as she saw it, was at last critical, and no longer to be trifled with in any way. Her figure, as she insisted, although this was largely imaginative on her part, had altered to such an extent that it would not be possible for her longer to conceal it, and all those who worked with her at the factory were soon bound to know. She could no longer work or sleep with any comfort. She must not stay here any more. She was having preliminary pains, purely imaginary ones in her case. He must marry her now, as he'd indicated he would, and leave with her at once, for some place, any place really, near or far, so long as she was extricated from this present terrible danger. And she would agree, as she now all but pleaded, to let him go his way again as soon as their child was born, truly, and would not ask any more of him ever, ever. But now, this very week, not later than the 15th at the latest, he must arrange to see her through with this as he had promised. But this meant that he would be leaving with her before ever he should have visited Sandra at 12th Lake at all, and without ever seeing her any more really, and besides, as he so well knew, he'd not saved the sum necessary to make possible the new venture on which he was insisting. In vain it was that Roberta now explained that she'd saved over 100, and they could make use of that once they were married, or to help in connection with whatever expenses might be incurred in getting to wherever he should decide they were going. All that he would see or feel was that this meant the loss of everything to him, and that he would have to go away with her to some relatively nearby place and get work at anything he could in order to support her as best he might. But the misery of such a change, the loss of all his splendid dreams, and yet, racking his brains, he could think of nothing better than that she should quit and go home for the time being, since, as he now argued, and most shrewdly as he thought, he needed a few more weeks to prepare for the change which was upon them both. For in spite of all his efforts, as he now falsely asserted, he'd not been able to save as much as he had hoped. He needed at least 3 or 4 more weeks in which to complete the sum, which he had been looking upon as advisable in the face of this meditated change. Was not she herself guessing, as he knew, that it could not be less than $150 or $200, quite large sums in her eyes, whereas, above his current salary, Clyde had no more than $40, and was dreaming of using that and whatever else he might secure in the interim to meet such expenses as might be incurred in the anticipated visit to 12th Lake. But to further support his evasive suggestion that she now return to her home for a short period, he added that she would want to fix herself up a little, wouldn't she? She couldn't go away on a trip like this, which involved marriage and a change of social contacts in every way, without some improvements in her wardrobe. Why not take her $100, or a part of it anyhow, and use it for that? So desperate was his state that he even suggested that. And Roberta, who in the face of her own uncertainty up to this time as to what was to become of her, had not ventured to prepare or purchase anything relating either to a trousseau or layette, now began to think that whatever the ulterior purpose of his suggestion, which like all the others was connected with delay, it might not be unwise even now if she did take a fortnight or 3 weeks, and with the assistance of an inexpensive and yet tolerable dressmaker, who'd aided her sister at times, make at least 1 or 2 suitable dresses, a flowered gray taffeta afternoon dress, such as she'd once seen in a movie, in which, should Clyde keep his word, she could be married. To match this pleasing little costume, she planned to add a chic little gray silk hat, poke-shaped, with pink or scarlet cherries nestled up under the brim, together with a neat little blue serge traveling suit, which, with brown shoes and a brown hat, would make her as smart as any bride. The fact that such preparations as these meant additional delay and expense, or that Clyde might not marry her after all, or that this proposed marriage from the point of view of both was the tarnished and discolored thing that it was still not sufficient to take from the thought of marriage as an event, or sacrament even, that proper-colored romance with which it was invested in her eyes, and from which, even under such an unsatisfactory set of circumstances as these, it could not be divorced. And strangely enough, in spite of all the troubled and strained relations that had developed between them, she still saw Clyde in much the same light in which she'd seen him at first. He was a Griffiths, a youth of genuine social if not financial distinction, one whom all the girls in her position, as well as many of those far above her, would be delighted to be connected with in this way, that is, via marriage. He might be objecting to marrying her, but he was a person of consequence just the same, and one with whom, if he would but trouble to care for her a little, she could be perfectly happy. And at any rate, once he'd loved her, and it was said of men, some men, anyway, so she'd heard her mother and others say, that once a child was presented to them, it made a great difference in their attitude toward the mother sometimes. They came to like the mother, too, anyhow for a little while, a very little while. If what she'd agreed to were strictly observed, she would have him with her to assist her through this great crisis, to give his name to her child, to aid her until she could once more establish herself in some way. For the time being, therefore, and with no more plan than this, although with great misgivings and nervous qualms, since, as she could see, Clyde was decidedly indifferent, she rested on this. And it was in this mood that 5 days later, and after Roberta had written to her parents that she was coming home for 2 weeks at least, to get a dress or two made, and to rest a little, because she was not feeling very well, that Clyde saw her off for her home in Bouts, riding with her as far as Fonda. But in so far as he was concerned, and since he had really no definite or workable idea, it seemed important to him that only silence was the great and all-essential thing now, so that even under the impending edge of the knife of disaster, he might be able to think more and more and more, without being compelled to do anything, and without momentarily being tortured by the thought that Roberta, in some nervous or moody or frantic state, would say or do something which, assuming that he should hit upon some helpful thought or plan in connection with Sandra, would prevent him from executing it. And about the same time, Sandra was writing him gay notes from Twelfth Lake as to what he might expect upon his arrival a little later: blue water, white sails, tennis, golf, horseback riding, driving. She had it all arranged with Bertine, as she said, and kisses, kisses, kisses. Chapter 42. 2 letters, which arrived at this time and simultaneously, but accentuated the difficulty of all this. Pine Point Landing, June 10th. Clydey-Midey, how is my feet thing? All whitey? It's just glorious up here. Lots of people already here and more coming every day. The casino and golf course over at Pine Point are open and lots of people about. I can hear Stewart and Grant with their launches going up toward Gray's Inlet now. You must hurry and come up, dear. It's too nice for words. Green roads to gallop through, and swimming and dancing at the casino every afternoon at 4. Just back from a wonderful gallop on Dickie, and going again after luncheon to mail these letters. Bertine says she'll write you a letter today or tomorrow, good for any weekend or any old time. So when Sonda says come, you hear? Else Sonda whip hard, you baddie good boy. Is he working hard in the baddie old factory? Sonda wishes he was here with her instead. We'd ride and drive and swim and dance. Don't forget your tennis racket and golf clubs. There's a dandy course on the casino grounds. This morning when I was riding, a bird flew right up under Dickie's heels. It scared him so that he bolted, and Sonda got all switched and swatched. Isn't Clydey sorry for his Sonda? She's writing lots of notes today. After lunch and the ride to catch the down mail, Sonda and Bertine and Nina going to the casino. Don't you wish you were going to be there? We could dance to Toddy. Sonda just loves that song. But she has to dress now. More tomorrow, baddie boy. And when Bertine writes, answer right away. See all those dots? Kisses, big and little ones, all for baddie boy. And white Sonda every day, and she'll write ooh. More kisses. To which Clyde responded eagerly and in kind in the same hour. But almost the same mail, at least the same day, brought the following letter from Roberta. Bouts, June 10th. Dear Clyde, I'm nearly ready for bed, but I'll write you a few lines. I had such a tiresome journey coming up that I was nearly sick. In the first place, I didn't want to come much alone, as you know. I feel too upset and uncertain about everything, although I try not to feel so now that we have our plan, and you're going to come for me as you said." At this point, while nearly sickened by the thought of the wretched country world in which he lived still, because of Roberta's unfortunate and unavoidable relation to it, he now experienced one of his old-time twinges of remorse and pity in regard to her. For after all, this was not her fault. She had so little to look forward to, nothing but her work or a commonplace marriage. For the first time in many days, really, and in the absence of both, he was able to think clearly, and to sympathize deeply, if gloomily. For the remainder of the letter read, "But it's very nice here now. The trees are so beautifully green and the flowers in bloom. I can hear the bees in the orchard whenever I go near the south windows. On the way up, instead of coming straight home, I decided to stop at Homer to see my sister and brother-in-law, since I'm not so sure now when I shall see them again, if ever, for I'm resolved that they shall see me respectable or never at all any more. You mustn't think I mean anything hard or mean by this. I'm just sad. They have such a cute little home there, Clyde. Pretty furniture, a Victrola and all, and Agnes is so very happy with Fred. I hope she always will be. I couldn't help thinking of what a dear place we might have had, if only my dreams had come true. And nearly all the time I was there, Fred kept teasing me as to why I don't get married until I said, 'Oh, well, Fred, you mustn't be too sure that I won't one of these days. All good things come to him who waits, you know.' 'Yes, unless you just turn out to be a waiter,' was the way he hit me back. But I was truly glad to see Mother again, Clyde. She's so loving and patient and helpful. The sweetest, dearest mother that ever was. And I just hate to hurt her in any way. And Tom and Emily, too. They've had their friends here every evening since I've been here, and they want me to join in. But I hardly feel well enough now to do all the things they want me to do. Play cards and games, dance." At this point Clyde could not help emphasizing in his own mind the shabby home world of which he was a part, and which so recently he'd seen. That rickety house, those toppling chimneys, her uncouth father, and that in contrast to such a letter as this other from Sandra. Father and Mother and Tom and Emily just seem to hang around and try to do things for me, and I feel remorseful when I think how they would feel if they knew, for of course I have to pretend that it is work that makes me feel so tired and depressed as I am sometimes. Mother keeps saying that I must stay a long time or quit entirely and rest and get well again. But she just don't know, of course, poor dear. If she did, I can't tell you how that makes me feel sometimes, Clyde. Oh, dear. But there, I mustn't put my sad feelings over on you either. I don't want to, as I told you, if you'll only come and get me as we've agreed. And I won't be like that either, Clyde. I'm not that way all the time now. I've started to get ready and do all the things it'll take to do in 3 weeks, and that's enough to keep my mind off everything but work. But you will come for me, won't you, dear? You won't disappoint me any more and make me suffer this time like you have so far, for, oh, how long it's been now. Ever since I was here before at Christmas time, really. But you were truly nice to me. I promise not to be a burden on you, for I know you don't really care for me any more, and so I don't care much what happens now, so long as I get out of this. But I truly promise not to be a burden on you. Oh, dear, don't mind this blot. I just don't seem to be able to control myself these days like I once could. But as for what I came for, the family think they're closed for a party down in Lycurgus, and that I must be having a wonderful time. Well, it's better that way than the other. I may have to come as far as Fonda to get some things, if I don't send Mrs. Ance, the dressmaker, and if so, and if you wanted to see me again before you come, although I don't suppose you do, you could. I'd like to see you and talk to you again if you care to, before we start. It all seems so funny to me, Clyde, having these clothes made and wishing to see you so much, and yet knowing that you'd rather not do this. And yet I hope you're satisfied now that you've succeeded in making me leave Lycurgus and come up here, and are having what you call a good time. Are they so very much better than the ones we used to have last summer, when we went about to the lakes and everywhere? But whatever they are, Clyde, surely you can afford to do this for me without feeling too bad. I know it seems hard to you now, but you don't want to forget either that if I was like some that I know, I might and would ask more. But as I told you, I'm not like that and never could be. If you don't really want me after you've helped me out, like I said, you can go. Please write me, Clyde, a long, cheery letter, even though you don't want to, and tell me all about how you've not thought of me once since I've been away or missed me at all. You used to, you know, and how you don't want me to come back, and you can't possibly come up before 2 weeks from Saturday if then. Oh, dear, I don't mean the horrid things I write, but I'm so blue and tired and lonely that I can't help it at times. I need someone to talk to, not just anyone here, because they don't understand, and I can't tell anybody. But there, I said I wouldn't be blue or gloomy or cross, and yet I haven't done so very well this time, have I? But I promise to do better next time, tomorrow or next day, because it relieves me to write you, Clyde. And won't you please write me just a few words to cheer me up while I'm waiting, whether you mean it or not? I need it so. And you will come, of course. I'll be so happy and grateful, and try not to bother you too much in any way. Your lonely bird. This book is continued on cassette number 12, side 1. Please fast forward to the end of this tape. An American Tragedy, continuing on cassette number 12, side 1. It was the contrast presented by these two scenes which finally determined for Clyde the fact that he would never marry Roberta. Never, nor even go to her at Bouts, or let her come back to him here if he could avoid that. For would not his going or her return put a period to all the joys that so recently in connection with Sandra had come to him here? Make it impossible for him to be with Sandra at 12th Lake this summer? Make it impossible for him to run away with and marry her? In God's name, was there no way, no outlet from this horrible difficulty which now confronted him? And in a fit of despair, having found the letters in his room on his return from work one warm evening in June, he now threw himself upon his bed and fairly groaned. The misery of this, the horror of his almost insoluble problem. Was there no way by which he could be persuaded to go away and stay, remain at home, maybe for a while longer, while he sent her $10 a week, or 12 even, a full half of all his salary? Or could she go to some neighboring town, Fonda, Gloversville, Schenectady? She was not so far gone but what she could take care of herself well enough as yet, and rent a room and remain there quietly until the fatal time, when she could go to some doctor or nurse. He might help her to find someone like that when the time came, if only she would be willing not to mention his name. But this business of making him come to Bouts, or meeting her somewhere, and that within 2 weeks or less, he would not. He would not. He would do something desperate if she tried to make him do that. Run away, or maybe go up to 12th Lake before it should be time for him to go to Bouts, or before she would think it was time, and then persuade Sandra if he could. But oh, what a wild, wild chance was that! To run away with and marry him, even if she wasn't quite 18, and then being married, and her family not being able to divorce them, and Roberta not being able to find him either, but only to complain. Well, couldn't he deny it, say that it was not so, that he had never had any relationship other than that which any department head might have with any girl working for him? He'd not been introduced to the Gilpins, nor had he gone with Roberta to see that Dr. Glenn near Gloversville, and she'd told him at the time she'd not mentioned his name. But the nerve of trying to deny it, the courage it would take, the courage to try to face Roberta when, as he knew, her steady, accusing, horrified, innocent blue eyes would be about as difficult to face as anything in all the world. And could he do that? Had he the courage? And would it all work out satisfactorily if he did? Would Sandra believe him, once she heard? But just the same, in pursuance of this idea, whether finally he executed it or not, even though he went to 12th Lake, he must write Sandra a letter saying that he was coming. And this he did at once, writing her passionately and yearningly. At the same time he decided not to write Roberta at all. Maybe call her on long distance, since she'd recently told him that there was a neighbor nearby who had a telephone, and if for any reason he needed to reach her he could use that. Or writing her in regard to all this, even in the most guarded way, would place in her hands, and at this time, exactly the type of evidence in regard to this relationship which you would most need, and especially when he was so determined not to marry her. The trickery of all this! It was low and shabby, no doubt. Yet if only Roberta had agreed to be a little reasonable with him, he would never have dreamed of indulging in any such low and tricky plan as this. But oh, Sandra, and the great estate that she had described, lying along the west shore of 12th Lake, how beautiful that must be! He could not help it. He must act and plan as he was doing. He must. And forthwith he arose and went to mail the letter to Sandra, and then while out, having purchased an evening paper, and hoping via the local news of all whom he knew to divert his mind for the time being, there upon the first page of the Times-Union of Albany was an item which read, "Accidental double tragedy at Pass Lake. Upturned canoe and floating hats reveal probable loss of 2 lives at resort near Pittsville. Unidentified body of girl recovered. That of companion still missing." Because of his own great interest in canoeing, and indeed in any form of water life, as well as his own particular skill when it came to rowing, swimming, diving, he now read with interest, "Penn Coast, Massachusetts, June 7th. What proved to be a fatal boat ride for 2, apparently, was taken here day before yesterday by an unidentified man and girl who came presumably from Pittsfield to spend the day at Pass Lake, which is 14 miles north of this place. Tuesday morning a man and a girl who said to Thomas Lucas, who conducts the casino lunch and boathouse there, that they were from Pittsfield, rented a small rowboat about 10 o'clock in the morning, and with a basket, presumably containing lunch, departed for the northern end of the lake. At 7 o'clock last evening, when they did not return, Mr. Lucas, in company with his son Geoffrey, made a tour of the lake in his motorboat, and discovered the rowboat upside down in the shallows near the north shore, but no trace of the occupants. Thinking at the time that it might be another instance of renters having decamped in order to avoid payment, he returned the boat to his own dock. But this morning, doubtful as to whether or not an accident had occurred, he and his assistant Fred Walsh, together with his son, made a second tour of the north shore, and finally came upon the hats of both the girl and the man floating among some rushes near the shore. At once a dredging party was organized, and by 3 o'clock today the body of the girl, concerning whom nothing is known here, other than that she came here with her companion, was brought up and turned over to the authorities. That of the man has not yet been found. The water in the immediate vicinity of the accident in some places being over 30 feet deep, it is not certain whether the trolling and dredging will yield the other body or not. In the case of a similar accident, which took place here some 15 years ago, neither body was ever recovered. To the lining of the small jacket which the girl wore was sewed the tag of a Pittsfield dealer. Also in a shoe lining was stamped the name of Jacobs of this same city. But other than these, there was no evidence as to her identity. It is assumed by the authorities here that if she carried a bag of any kind, it lies at the bottom of the lake. The man is recalled as being tall, dark, about 35 years of age, and wore a light green suit and straw hat with a white and blue band. The girl appears to be not more than 25, 5 feet 5 inches tall, and weighs 130 pounds. She wore her hair, which was long and dark brown, in braids about her forehead. On her left middle finger is a small gold ring with an amethyst setting. The police of Pittsfield and other cities in this vicinity have been notified, but as yet no word as to her identity has been received. This item, commonplace enough in the usual grist of summer accidents, interested Clyde only slightly. It seemed odd, of course, that a girl and a man should arrive at a small lake anywhere, and setting forth in a small boat in broad daylight thus lose their lives. Also it was odd that afterwards no one should be able to identify either of them, and yet here it was. The man had disappeared for good. He threw the paper down, little concerned at first, and turned to other things, the problem that was confronting him, really, how he was to do. But later, and because of that, and as he was putting out the light before getting into bed, and still thinking of the complicated problem which his own life here presented, he was struck by the thought, what devil's whisper, what evil hint of an evil spirit? Supposing that he and Roberta, he and Sandra, Sandra could swim so well, and so could he. He and Roberta were in a small boat somewhere, and it should capsize at the very time, of this dreadful complication which was so harassing him. What an escape! What a relief from a gigantic and by now really destroying problem. On the other hand, hold, not so fast. For could a man even think of such a solution in connection with so difficult a problem as his, without committing a crime in his heart, really? A horrible, terrible crime. He must not even think of such a thing. It was wrong, terribly wrong. And yet, supposing, by accident, of course, such a thing as this did occur, that would be the end, then, wouldn't it, of all his troubles in connection with Roberta? No more terror as to her, no more fear and heartache even as to Sandra. A noiseless, pathless, quarrelless solution of all his present difficulties, and only joy before him forever. Just an accidental, unpremeditated drowning, and then the glorious future which would be his. But the mere thinking of such a thing in connection with Roberta at this time, why was it that his mind persisted in identifying her with it, was terrible, and he must not allow such a thought to enter his mind. Never, never, never. He must not. It was horrible, terrible. A thought of murder, no less. Murder? Yet so wrought up had he been, and still was, by the letter which Roberta had written him, as contrasted with the one from Sandra, so delightful and enticing was the picture of her life and his, as she now described it, that he could not for the life of him quite expel that other and seemingly easy and so natural a solution of all his problems. If only such an accident could occur to him and Roberta. For after all, he was not planning any crime, was he? Was he not merely thinking of an accident that, had it occurred, or could it but occur in his case? Ah, but that, could it but occur? There was the dark and evil thought about which he must not think. He must not. And yet, he was an excellent swimmer, and could swim ashore, no doubt, whatever the distance, whereas Roberta, as he knew from swimming with her at one beach and another the previous summer, could not swim. And then, unless he chose to help her, of course. As he thought, and for the time, sitting in the lamplight of his own room between 9:30 and 10 at night, a strange and disturbing creepiness as to flesh and hair and fingertips assailed him. The wonder and the horror of such a thought, and presented to him by this paper in this way. Wasn't that strange? Besides, up in that lake country to which he was now going to Sandra, were many, many lakes about everywhere, were there not? Scores up there where Sandra was, or so she'd said. And Roberta loved the out-of-doors and the water so, although she could not swim. Could not swim. And they, or at least he, was going where the lakes were, or they might they not? And if not, why not? Since both had talked of some 4th of July resort in their planning their final departure, he and Roberta. But no, the mere thought of an accident such as that in connection with her, however much he might wish to be rid of her, was sinful, dark, and terrible. He must not let his mind run on any such things for even a moment. It was too wrong, too vile, too terrible. Oh, dreadful thought! To think it should have come to him, and at this time of all times, when she was demanding that he go away with her. Death, murder, the murder of Roberta. But to escape her, of course, this unreasonable, unshakable, unchangeable demand of hers. Already he was quite cold, quite damp, with the mere thought of it. And now, when? But he must not think of that. The death of that unborn child, too. But how could anyone even think of doing any such thing with calculation, deliberately? And yet many people were drowned like that, boys and girls, men and women, here and there, everywhere the world over in the summer-time. To be sure, he would not want anything like that to happen to Roberta, and especially at this time. He was not that kind of a person, whatever else he was. He was not. The mere thought now caused a damp perspiration to form on his hands and face. He was not that kind of a person. Decent, sane people did not think of such things, and so he would not either, from this hour on. In a tremulous state of dissatisfaction with himself, that any such grisly thought should have dared to obtrude itself upon him in this way, he got up and lit the lamp, reread this disconcerting item in as cold and reprobative way as he could achieve, feeling that in so doing he was putting anything at which it hinted far from him once and for all. Then, having done so, he dressed and went out of the house for a walk, up Waikiki Avenue, along Central Avenue, out Oak, and then back on Spruce into Central again, feeling that he was walking away from the insinuating thought or suggestion that had so troubled him up to now, and after a time, feeling better, freer, more natural, more human, as he so much wished to feel, he returned to his room once more to sleep, with the feeling that he'd actually succeeded in eliminating completely a most insidious and horrible visitation. He must never think of it again. He must never think of it again. He must never, never, never think of it. Never. And then, falling into a nervous, feverish doze soon thereafter, he found himself dreaming of a savage black dog that was trying to bite him. Having escaped from the fangs of the creature by waking in terror, he once more fell asleep. But now he was in some very strange and gloomy place, a wood or a cave or narrow canyon between deep hills, from which a path, fairly promising at first, seemed to lead. But soon the path, as he progressed along it, became narrower and darker, and finally disappeared entirely. And then, turning to see if he could not get back as he'd come, there directly behind him were arrayed an entangled mass of snakes that at first looked more like a pile of brush. But above it waved the menacing heads of at least a score of reptiles, forked tongues and agate eyes. And in front now, as he turned swiftly, a horned and savage animal, huge it was, its heavy tread crushing the brush, blocked the path in that direction. And then, horrified and crying out in hopeless desperation, once more he woke, not to sleep again that night. Chapter 43. Yet a thought such as that of the lake, connected as it was with the predicament by which he was being faced, and shrink from it though he might, was not to be dismissed as easily as he desired, born as it was of its accidental relation to this personal problem that was shaking and troubling and all but disarranging his own none too forceful mind. This smooth, seemingly blameless, if dreadful blotting out of two lives at Pass Lake had its weight. That girl's body, as some peculiar force in his own brain now still compelled him to think, being found, but the man's not. In that interesting fact, and this quite in spite of himself, lurked a suggestion that insisted upon obtruding itself on his mind, to wit, that it might be possible that the man's body was not in that lake at all. For since evil-minded people did occasionally desire to get rid of other people, might it not be possible that that man had gone there with that girl in order to get rid of her? A very smooth and devilish trick, of course, but one which in this instance at least seemed to have succeeded admirably. But as for him accepting such an evil suggestion and acting upon it, never. Yet here was his own problem growing hourly more desperate, since every day, or at least every other day, brought him either letters from Roberta or a note from Sandra, their respective missives maintaining the same relative contrast between ease and misery, gaiety of mood, and the somberness of defeat and uncertainty. To Roberta, since he would not write her, he was telephoning briefly and in as non-committal a manner as possible. How was she? He was so glad to hear from her, and to know that she was out in the country and at home, where it must be much nicer than in the factory here in this weather. Everything was going smoothly, of course, and except for a sudden rush of orders, which made it rather hard these last 2 days, all was as before. He was doing his best to save a certain amount of money for a certain project about which he knew, but otherwise he was not worrying about anything, and she must not. He had not written before because of the work, and could not write much. There were so many things to do. But he missed seeing her in her old place, and was looking forward to seeing her again soon. If she were coming down toward Lycurgus, as she said, and really thought it important to see him, well, that could be arranged, maybe. But was it necessary right now? He was so very busy, and expected to see her later, of course. But at the same time he was writing Sandra that assuredly on the 18th and the weekend following, if possible, he would be with her. So by virtue of such mental prestidigitation and tergiversation, inspired and animated as it was by his desire for Sandra, his inability to face the facts in connection with Roberta, he achieved the much-coveted privilege of again seeing her, over one weekend at least, and in such a setting as never before in his life had he been privileged to witness. or as he came down to the public dock at Sharon, adjoining the veranda of the inn at the foot of 12th Lake, he was met by Bertine and her brother as well as Sandra, who in Grant's launch had motored down the chain to pick him up. The bright blue waters of the Indian chain, the tall dark spear pines that sentineled the shores on either side, and gave to the waters at the west a band of black shadow where the trees were mirrored so clearly, the small and large, white and pink and green and brown lodges on every hand, with their boathouses, pavilions by the shore, an occasional slender pier reaching out from some spacious and at times stately summer lodge, such as those now owned by the Cranstons, Finchleys, and others, the green and blue canoes and launches, the gay hotel and pavilion at Pine Point, already smartly attended by the early arrivals here, and then the pier and boathouse of the Cranston Lodge itself, with 2 Russian wolfhounds recently acquired by Bertine lying on the grass near the shore, apparently awaiting her return, and a servant John, one of a half-dozen who attended the family here, waiting to take the single bag of Clyde, his tennis racket, and golf sticks. But most of all he was impressed by the large, rambling, and yet smartly designed house, with its bright geranium-bordered walks, its wide brown wicker-studded veranda, commanding a beautiful view of the lake, the cars and personalities of the various guests, who in golf, tennis, or lounging clothes were to be seen idling here and there. At Bertine's request, John at once showed him to a spacious room overlooking the lake, where it was his privilege now to bathe and change for tennis with Sandra, Bertine, and Grant. After dinner, as explained by Sandra, who was over at Bertine's for the occasion, he was to come over with Bertine and Grant to the casino, where he would be introduced to such as all here knew. There was to be dancing. Tomorrow in the morning, early, before breakfast, if he chose, he should ride with her and Bertine and Stuart along a wonderful woodland trail through the forest to the west, which led to Inspiration Point and a more distant view of the lake. And, as he now learned, except for a few such paths as this, the forest was trackless for 40 miles. Without a compass or guide, as he was told, one might wander to one's death even. So evasive were directions to those who did not know. And after breakfast and a swim, she and Bertine and Nina Temple would demonstrate their new skill with Sandra's aquaplane. After that, lunch, tennis or golf, a trip to the casino for tea. After dinner at the lodge of the Brookshaws of Utica across the lake, there was to be dancing. Within an hour after his arrival, as Clyde could see, the program for the weekend was already full. But that he and Sandra would contrive not only moments, but possibly hours together, he well knew, and then he would see what new delight, in connection with their many-faceted temperament, the wonderful occasion would provide. To him, in spite of the dour burden of Roberta, which for this one weekend at least he could lay aside, it was as though he were in paradise. And on the tennis grounds of the Cranstons, it seemed as though never before had Sandra, attired in a short, severe white tennis skirt and blouse, with a yellow and green dotted handkerchief tied about her hair, seemed so gay, graceful, and happy. The smile that was upon her lips, the gay, laughing light of promise that was in her eyes whenever she glanced at him, and now and then, in running to serve him, it was as though she were poised bird-like in flight, her racket arm high, a single toe seeming barely to touch the ground, her head thrown back, her lips parted and smiling always, and in calling 20 love, 30 love, 40 love, it was always with a laughing accent on the word love, which at once thrilled and saddened him, as he saw, and rejoiced in from one point of view, she was his to take, if only he were free to take her now. But this other black barrier which he himself had built, and then this scene, where a bright sun poured a flood of crystal light upon a greensward that stretched from tall pines to the silver rippling waters of a lake, and offshore in a half-dozen different directions the bright white sails of small boats, the white and green and yellow splashes of color where canoes paddled by idling lovers were passing in the sun. Summertime, leisure, warmth, color, ease, beauty, love, all that he'd dreamed of the summer before, when he was so very much alone. At moments it seemed to Clyde that he would reel from very joy of the certain fulfillment of a great desire that was all but immediately within his control. At other times, the thought of Roberta sweeping down upon him as an icy wind, as though nothing could be more sad, terrible, numbing to the dreams of beauty, love, and happiness than this which now threatened him. That terrible item about the lake and those 2 people drowned. the probability that in spite of his wild plan, within a week or 2 or 3 at most, he would have to leave all this forever. And then of a sudden he would wake to realize that he was fumbling or playing badly, that Bertine or Sandra or Grant was calling, "Oh, Clyde, what are you thinking of anyhow?" And from the darkest depths of his heart he would have answered, had he spoken, "Roberta." At the Brookshaws again that evening, a smart company of friends of Sandra's, Bertine's, and others. On the dance floor, a re-encounter with Sandra, all smiles, for she was pretending for the benefit of others here, her mother and father in particular, that she had not seen Clyde before, did not even know that he was here. "You up here? That's great. Over at the Cranstons? Oh, isn't that dandy? Right next door to us. Well, we'll see a lot of each other, what? How about a canter tomorrow before 7? Bertine and I go nearly every day. And we'll have a picnic tomorrow if nothing interferes, canoeing and motoring. Don't worry about not riding well. I'll get Bertine to let you have Jerry. He's just a sheep. And you don't need to worry about togs either. Grant has scads of things. I'll dance the next 2 dances with others, but you sit out the 3rd one with me, will you? I know a peach of a place outside on the balcony." She was off with fingers extended, but with a "we understand each other" look in her eye. And outside in the shadow later, she pulled his face to hers when no one was looking, and kissed him eagerly. And before the evening was over, they had managed, by strolling along a path which led away from the house along the lake shore, to embrace under the moon. "Sandra's so glad Clydie here. Misses him so much." She smoothed his hair as he kissed her, and Clyde, bethinking him of the shadow which lay so darkly between them, brushed her feverishly, desperately. "Oh, my darling baby girl!" he exclaimed. "My beautiful, beautiful Sandra! If you only knew how much I love you. If you only knew. I wish I could tell you all. I wish I could." But he could not now or ever. He would never dare to speak to her of even so much as a phase of the black barrier that now lay between them. For with her training, the standards of love and marriage that had been set for her, she would never understand, never be willing to make so great a sacrifice for love as much as she loved him. And he would be left, abandoned on the instant, and with what horror in her eyes! Yet, looking into his eyes, his face white and tense, and the glow of the moon above making small white electric sparks in his eyes, she exclaimed as he gripped her tightly, "Does he love Sandra so much? Oh, sweetie boy, Sandra loves him too." She seized his head between her hands and held it tight, kissing him swiftly and ardently a dozen times. "And Sandra won't give her Clydie up either. She won't. You just wait and see. It doesn't matter what happens now. It may not be so very easy, but she won't." Then, as suddenly and practically, as so often was her way, she exclaimed, "But we must go now, right away. No, not another kiss now. No, no, Sandra says no, now. They'll be missing us." And straightening up and pulling him by the arm, she hurried him back to the house in time to meet Palmer Thurston, who was looking for her. The next morning, true to her promise, there was the canter to Inspiration Point, and that before 7. Bertine and Sandra in bright red riding coats and white breeches and black boots, their hair unbound and loose to the wind, and riding briskly on before for the most part, then racing back to where he was, or Sandra hallooing gaily for him to come on, or the 2 of them laughing and chatting 100 yards ahead in some concealed chapel of the aisle trees where he could not see them. And because of the interest which Sandra was so obviously manifesting in him these days, an interest which Bertine herself had begun to feel might end in marriage, if no family complications arose to interfere, she, Bertine, was all smiles, the very soul of cordiality, winsomely insisting that he should come up and stay for the summer, and she would chaperone them both, so that no one would have a chance to complain. And Clyde, thrilling and yet brooding too by turns, occasionally, and in spite of himself, drifting back to the thought that the item in the paper had inspired, and yet fighting it, trying to shut it out entirely. And then at one point Sandra, turning down a steep path which led to a stony and moss-lipped spring between the dark trees, called to Clyde to "Come on down. Jerry knows the way. He won't slip. Come and get a drink. If you do, you'll come back again soon, so they say." And once he was down and had dismounted to drink, she exclaimed, "I've been wanting to tell you something. You should have seen Mamma's face last night when she heard you were up here. She can't be sure that I had anything to do with it, of course, because she thinks that Bertine likes you too. I made her think that. But just the same she suspects that I had a hand in it, I guess, and she doesn't quite like it. But she can't say anything more than she has before. And I had a talk with Bertine just now, and she's agreed to stick by me and help me all she can. But we'll have to be even more careful than ever now, because I think if Mamma got too suspicious, I don't know what she might do. Want us to leave here, even now maybe, just so I couldn't see you. You know she feels that I shouldn't be interested in anyone yet except someone she likes. You know how it is. She's that way with Stuart, too. But if you'll take care not to show that you care for me so much whenever we're around any one of our crowd, I don't think she'll do anything. Not now, anyhow. Later on in the fall, when we're back in Lycurgus, things will be different. I'll be of age then, and I'm going to see what I can do. I never loved anyone before, but I do love you. And, well, I won't give you up, that's all. I won't. And they can't make me either. She stamped her foot and struck her boot, the while the two horses looked idly and vacantly about, and Clyde, enthused and astonished by this second definite declaration in his behalf, as well as fired by the thought that now, if ever, he might suggest the elopement and marriage, and so rid himself of the sword that hung so threateningly above him, now gazed at Sandra, his eyes filled with a nervous hope and a nervous fear, for she might refuse and change too, shocked by the suddenness of his suggestion, and he had no money and no place in mind where they might go either, in case she accepted his proposal. But she had, perhaps, or she might have, and having once consented, might she not help him? Of course. At any rate, he felt that he must speak, leaving luck or ill luck to the future. And so he said, "Why couldn't you run away with me now, Sandra, darling? It's so long until fall, and I want you so much. Why couldn't we? Your mother's not likely to want to let you marry me then, anyhow. But if we went away now, she couldn't help herself, could she? And afterwards, in a few months or so, you could write her, and then she wouldn't mind. Why couldn't we, Sandra?" His voice was very pleading, his eyes full of a sad dread of refusal, and of the future that lay unprotected behind that. And by now so caught was she by the tremor with which his mood invested him, that she paused, not really shocked by the suggestion at all, but decidedly moved, as well as flattered by the thought that she was able to evoke in Clyde so eager and headlong a passion. He was so impetuous, so blazing now with a flame of her own creating, as she felt, yet which she was incapable of feeling as much as he, as she knew. Such a flame as she'd never seen in him or anyone else before. And would it not be wonderful if she could run away with him now, secretly, to Canada or New York or Boston or anywhere? The excitement her elopement would create here and elsewhere, in Lycurgus, Albany, Utica, the talk and feeling in her own family as well as elsewhere. And Gilbert would be related to her in spite of him, and the Griffiths too, whom her mother and father so much admired. For a moment there was written in her eyes the desire and the determination almost to do as he suggested, run away, make a great lark of this, her intense and true love. For once married, what could her parents do? And was not Clyde worthy of her, and them too? Of course, even though nearly all in her set fancied that he was not quite all he should be, just because he didn't have as much money as they had. But he would have, would he not, after he was married to her, and get as good a place in her father's business as Gil Griffiths had in his father's. Yet a moment later, thinking of her life here and what her going off in such a way would mean to her father and mother just then, in the very beginning of the summer season, as well as how it would disrupt her own plans and cause her mother to feel especially angry, and perhaps even to bring about the dissolution of the marriage on the ground that she was not of age, she paused, that gay light of adventure replaced by a marked trace of the practical and the material that so persistently characterized her. What difference would a few months make, anyhow? It might, and no doubt would, save Clyde from being separated from her forever, whereas their present course might ensure their separation. Accordingly, she now shook her head in a certain positive and yet affectionate way, which by now Clyde had come to know spelled defeat, the most painful and irremediable defeat that had yet come to him in connection with all this. She would not go. Then he was lost, and she to him forever, maybe. Oh, God! For while her face softened with a tenderness which was not usually there, even when she was most moved emotionally, she said, "I would, honey, if I did not think it best not to now. It's too soon. Mamma isn't going to do anything right now, I know she isn't. Besides, she's made all her plans to do a lot of entertaining here this summer, and for my particular benefit. She wants me to be nice to, well, you know who I mean, and I can be, without doing anything to interfere with us in any way, I'm sure. So long as I don't do anything to really frighten her. She paused to smile a reassuring smile. But you can come up here as often as you choose, don't you see? And she and these others won't think anything of it, because you won't be our guest, don't you see? I fixed all that with Bertine, and that means that we can see each other all summer long up here, just as much as we want to, don't you see? Then in the fall when I come back, and if I find that I can't make her be nice to you at all, or consider our being engaged, why, I will run away with you. Yes, I will, darling, really and truly. Darling, the fall. She stopped, her eyes showing a very shrewd conception of all the practical difficulties before them, while she took both of his hands in hers and looked up into his face. Then, impulsively and conclusively, she threw both arms about his neck and, pulling his head down, kissed him. Can't you see, dearie? Please don't look so sad, darling. Sandra loves her Clyde so much, and she'll do anything and everything to make things come out right. Yes, she will, and they will too. Now you wait and see. She won't give him up, ever, ever. And Clyde, realizing that he had not one moving argument wherewith to confront her really, not one that might not cause her to think strangely and suspiciously of his intense anxiety, and that this because of Roberta's demand, and unless Roberta let him go, it all spelled defeat for him, now looked gloomily and even desperately upon her face. The beauty of her, the completeness of this world, and yet not to be allowed to possess her or it ever. And Roberta, with her demand, and his promise in the immediate background, and no way of escape save by flight. God! At this point it was that a nervous and almost deranged look, never so definite or powerful at any time before in his life, the borderline look between reason and unreason no less, so powerful that the quality of it was even noticeable to Sandra, came into his eyes. He looked sick, broken, unbelievably despairing, so much so that she exclaimed, Why, what is it, Clyde, dearie? You look so, I can't say just how, forlorn, or does he love me so much? And can't he wait just 3 or 4 months? But oh, yes, he can, too. It isn't as bad as he thinks. He'll be with me most of the time, the lovekins will. And when he isn't, Sandra'll write him every day, every day. But Sandra, if I could just tell you, if you knew how much it were going to mean to me. He paused here, for as he could see at this point, into the expression of Sandra came a practical inquiry as to what it was that made it so urgent for her to leave with him at once. And immediately on his part, Clyde sensing how enormous was the hold of this world on her, how integral a part of it she was, and how by merely too much insistence here and now he might so easily cause her to doubt the wisdom of her primary craze for him, was moved to desist, sure that if he spoke it would lead her to questioning him in such a way as might cause her to change, or at least to modify her enthusiasm to the point where even the dream of the fall might vanish. And so, instead of explaining further why he needed a decision on her part, he merely desisted, saying, It's because I need you so much now, dear, all of the time. That's it, just that. It seems at times as though I could never be away from you another minute any more. Oh, I'm so hungry for you all of the time. And yet Sandra, flattered as she was by this hunger and reciprocating it in part at least, merely repeated the various things she said before. They must wait. All would come out all right in the fall. And Clyde, quite numb because of his defeat, yet unable to forego or deny the delight of being with her now, did his best to recover his mood, and think that in some way, somehow, maybe via that plan of that boat or in some other way. But what other way? But no, not that. He was not a murderer and never could be. He was not a murderer, never. And yet this loss, this impending disaster, how to avoid that and win Sandra after all? How? Chapter 44. And then, on his return to Lycurgus early Monday morning, the following letter from Roberta. Dear Clyde, my dear, I've often heard the saying, it never rains but it pours, but I never knew what it meant until today. About the first person I saw this morning was Mr. Wilcox, a neighbor of ours, who came to say that Mrs. Ants would not be out today on account of some work she had to do for Mrs. Dinwiddie in Bouts, although when she left yesterday, everything had been prepared for her so that I could help her a little with the sewing and so hurry things up a bit. And now she won't be here until tomorrow. Next word came that Mother's sister, Mrs. Nichols, is very ill, and Mother had to go over to her house at Baker's Pond, which is about 12 miles east of here. Tom driving her, although he ought to be here to help Father with all the work that there is to do about the farm. And I don't know if Mother will be able to get back before Sunday. If I were better and didn't have all this work of my own on my hands, I would have to go too, I suppose, although Mother insists not. Next, Emily and Tom, thinking all is going so well with me and that I might enjoy it, we're having 4 girls and 4 boys come here tonight for a sort of June moon party with ice cream and cake to be made by Emily and Mother and myself. But now, poor dear, she has to do a lot of telephoning over Mr. Wilcox's phone, which we share, in order to put it off until some day next week, if possible. And she's just heartsick and gloomy, of course. As for myself, I'm trying to keep a stiff upper lip, as the saying is. But it's pretty hard, dear, I'll tell you. For so far I've only had 3 small telephone talks with you, saying that you didn't think you would have the necessary money before July 5th. And to put the finishing touches on it, as I only learned today, Mamma and Papa have about decided to go to my Uncle Charlie's in Hamilton for over the 4th, from the 4th to the 15th, and take me with them, unless I decide to return to Lycurgus, while Tom and Emily visit with my sister at Homer. But, dear, I can't do that, as you know. I'm too sick and worried. Last night I vomited dreadful, and I've been half dead on my feet all day, and I'm just about crazy tonight. Dear, what can we do? Can't you come for me before July 3rd, which will be the time they will be going? You'll have to come for me before then, really, because I just can't go up there with them. It's 50 miles from here. I could say I would go up there with them if only you would be sure to come for me before they start. But I must be absolutely sure that you're coming. Absolutely. Clyde, I've done nothing but cry since I got here. If you were only here, I wouldn't feel so badly. I do try to be brave, dear. But how can I help thinking at times that you will never come for me, when you haven't written me one single note and have only talked to me 3 times since I've been up here? But then I say to myself, you couldn't be so mean as that, and especially since you've promised. Oh, you will come, won't you? Everything worries me so now, Clyde, for some reason, and I'm so frightened, dear. I think of last summer and then this one and all my dreams. It won't make any real difference to you about your coming a few days sooner than you intended, will it, dear? Even if we have to get along on a little less, I know that we can. I can be very saving and economical. I will try to have my dresses made by then. If not, I will do with what I have and finish them later. And I will try and be brave, dear, and not annoy you much, if only you will come. You must, you know, Clyde. It can't be any other way, although for your sake now I wish it could. Please, please, Clyde, write and tell me that you'll be here at the end of the time that you said. I worry so and get so lonesome off here all by myself. I will come straight back to you if you don't come by the time you said. I know you will not like me to say this, but, Clyde, I can't stay here, and that's all there is to it. And I can't go away with Mamma and Papa either, so there's only one way out. I don't believe I will sleep a wink tonight, so please write me, and in your letter tell me over and over not to worry about your not coming for me. If you could only come today, dear, or this weekend, I wouldn't feel so blue. But nearly 2 weeks more. Everyone is in bed and the house is still, so I will stop. But please write me, dear, right away. Or if you won't do that, call me up sure tomorrow, because I just can't rest one single minute until I do hear from you. Your miserable Roberta. P.S. This is a horrid letter, but I just can't write a better one. I'm so blue. But the day this letter arrived in Lycurgus, Clyde was not there to answer it at once, and because of that, Roberta, being in the darkest and most hysterical mood and thought, sat down on Saturday afternoon, and half convinced as she was that he might already have departed for some distant point without any word to her, almost shrieked or screamed, if one were to properly characterize the mood that animated the following. Bouts, Saturday, June 14th. My dear Clyde, I'm writing to tell you that I'm coming back to Lycurgus. I simply can't stay here any longer. Mamma worries and wonders why I cry so much, and I'm just about sick. I know I promised to stay until the 25th or 26th, but then you said you'd write me, but you never have. Only an occasional telephone message when I'm almost crazy. I woke up this morning and couldn't help crying right away, and this afternoon my headache is dreadful. I'm so afraid you won't come, and I'm so frightened, dear. Please come and take me away someplace, anywhere, so I can get out of here and not worry like I do. I'm so afraid, in the state that I'm in, that Papa and Mamma may make me tell the whole affair, or that they will find it out for themselves. Oh, Clyde, you'll never know. You said you would come, and sometimes I know you will, but at other times I get to thinking about other things, and I'm just as certain you won't, especially when you don't write or telephone. I wish you would write and say that you will come just so I can stand to stay here. Just as soon as you get this, I wish you would write me and tell me the exact day you can come. Not later than the 1st, really, because I know I cannot stand to stay here any longer than then. Clyde, there isn't a girl in the whole world as miserable as I am, and you've made me so. But I don't mean that either, dear. You were good to me once, and you are now, offering to come for me. And if you'll come right away, I'll be so grateful. And when you read this, if you think I'm unreasonable, please do not mind it. Clyde, but just think I'm crazy with grief and worry, and that I just don't know what to do. Please write me, Clyde. If you only knew how I need a word. Roberta. This letter, coupled as it was with a threat to come to Lycurgus, was sufficient to induce in Clyde a state not unlike Roberta's. To think that he had no additional, let alone plausible excuse to offer Roberta, whereby she could be induced to delay her final and imperative demand. He racked his brains. He must not write her any long and self-incriminating letters. That would be foolish in the face of his determination not to marry her. Besides, his mood at the moment, so fresh from the arms and kisses of Sandra, was not for anything like that. He could not, even if he would. At the same time, something must be done at once, as he could see, in order to allay her apparently desperate mood. And 10 minutes after he'd finished reading the last of these 2 letters, he was attempting to reach Roberta over the telephone, and finally getting her after a troublesome and impatient half-hour, he heard her voice, thin and rather querulous as it seemed to him at first, but really only because of a poor connection, saying, "Hello, Clyde. Hello. Oh, I'm so glad you called. I've been terribly nervous. Did you get my 2 letters? I was just about to leave here in the morning if I didn't hear from you by then. I just couldn't stand not to hear anything. Where have you been, dear? Did you read what I said about my parents going away? That's true. Why don't you write, Clyde, or call me up anyhow? What about what I said in my letter about the 3rd? Will you be sure and come then? Or shall I meet you somewhere? I've been so nervous the last 3 or 4 days, but now that I hear you again, maybe I'll be able to quiet down some. But I do wish you'd write me a note every few days anyhow. Why won't you, Clyde? You haven't even written me once since I've been here. I can't tell you what a state I'm in and how hard it is to keep calm now." Plainly, Roberta was very nervous and fearsome as she talked. As a matter of fact, except that the home in which she was telephoning was deserted at the moment, she was talking very indiscreetly, it seemed to Clyde, and it aided but little in his judgment for her to explain that she was all alone and that no one could hear her. He did not want her to use his name or refer to letters written to him. Without talking too plainly, he now tried to make it clear that he was very busy, and that it was hard for him to write as much as she might think necessary. Had he not said that he was coming on the 28th or thereabouts if he could? Well, he would if he could, only it looked now as though it might be necessary for him to postpone it for another week or so, until the 7th or 8th of July, long enough for him to get together an extra 50 for which he had a plan, and which would be necessary for him to have, but really, which was the thought behind this other, long enough for him to pay one more visit to Sandra, as he was yearning to do over the next weekend. Into cassette number 12, side 1. To continue, please turn the cassette over. Cassette number 12, side 2 of An American Tragedy. This demand of Roberta's now. Couldn't she go with her parents for a week or so, and then let him come for her there, or she come to him. It would give him more needed time, But at this Roberta, bursting forth in a storm of nervous disapproval, saying that most certainly, if that were the case, she was going back to her room at the Gilpins, if she could get it, and not waste her time up there getting ready and waiting for him when he was not coming, he suddenly decided that he might as well say that he was coming on the 3rd, or that if he did not, that at least by then he would have arranged with her where to meet him, or even by now he'd not made up his mind as to how he was to do. He must have a little more time to think. More time to think. And so now he altered his tone greatly and said, "But listen, Bert, please don't be angry with me. You talk as though I didn't have any troubles in connection with all this either. You don't know what this may be going to cost me before I'm through with it, and you don't seem to care much. I know you're worried and all that, but what about me? I'm doing the very best I can now, Bert, with all I have to think about. But won't you just be patient now until the 3rd, anyhow? Please do. I promise to write you, and if I don't, I'll call you up every other day. Will that be all right? But I certainly don't want you to be using my name like you did a while ago. That will lead to trouble, sure. Please don't. And when I call again, I'll just say it's Mr. Baker asking, see? And you can say it's anyone you like afterwards. And then, if by any chance anything should come up that would stop our starting exactly on the 3rd, why, you can come back here if you want to, see? Or somewhere near here. And then we could start as soon as possible after that." His tone was so pleading and soothing, infused as it was, but because of his present necessity only with a trace of that old tenderness and seeming helplessness which at times had quite captivated Roberta, that even now it served to win her to a bizarre and groundless gratitude. So much so that at once she had replied warmly and emotionally even, "Oh, no, dear, I don't want to do anything like that. You know I don't. It's just because things are so bad as they are with me, and I can't help myself now. You know that, Clyde, don't you? I can't help loving you. I always will, I suppose. And I don't want to do anything to hurt you, dear. Really, I don't, if I can help it." And Clyde, hearing the ring of genuine affection, and sensing anew his old-time power over her, was disposed to reenact the role of lover again, if only in order to dissuade Roberta from being too harsh and driving with him now. For while he could not like her now, he told himself, and could not think of marrying her, still, in view of this other dream, he could at least be gracious to her, could he not? Pretend. And so this conversation ended with a new peace based on this agreement. The preceding day, a day of somewhat reduced activities on the lakes from which he had just returned, he and Sandra and Stuart and Bertine, together with Nina Temple and a youth named Harley Baggett, then visiting the Thurstons, had motored first from 12th Lake to 3 Mile Bay, a small lakeside resort some 25 miles north, and from thence between towering walls of pines to Big Britain, and some other smaller lakes lost in the recesses of the tall pines of the region to the north of Trine Lake. And en route, Clyde, as he now recalled, had been most strangely impressed at moments and in spots by the desolate and for the most part lonely character of the region. The narrow and rain-washed and even rutted nature of the dirt roads that wound between tall, silent, and darksome trees, forests in the largest sense of the word, that extended for miles and miles apparently on either hand, the decadent and weird nature of some of the bogs and tarns on either side of the only comparatively passable dirt roads, which here and there were festooned with funereal or viperous vines, and strewn like deserted battlefields with soggy and decayed piles of fallen and criss-crossed logs, in places as many as 4 deep, one above the other, in the green slime that an undrained depression in the earth had accumulated, the eyes and backs of occasional frogs that upon lichen or vine or moss-covered stumps and rotting logs in this warm June weather there sunned themselves apparently undisturbed, the spirals of gnats, the solitary flick of a snake's tail as disturbed by the sudden approach of the machine, one made off into the muck, and the poisonous grasses and water plants which were thickly embedded in it. And in seeing one of these, Clyde, for some reason, had thought of the accident at Pass Lake. He did not realize it, but at the moment his own subconscious need was contemplating the loneliness and the usefulness at times of such a lone spot as this. And at one point it was that a whir-whir, one of the solitary water-birds of this region, uttered its oof and barkest cry, flying from somewhere near into some darker recess within the woods. And at this sound it was that Clyde had stirred nervously and then sat up in the car. It was so very different to any bird cry he'd ever heard before. What was that? he asked of Harley Baggett, who sat next to him. "What?" "Why, that bird or something that just flew away back there just now." "I didn't hear any bird." "Gee, that was a queer sound. It makes me feel creepy." As interesting and impressive as anything else to him in this almost tenantless region had been the fact that there were so many lonesome lakes, not one of which he'd ever heard of before. The territory through which they were speeding as fast as the dirt roads would permit was dotted with them in these deep forests of pine, and only occasionally, in passing near one, were there any signs indicating a camp or lodge, and those to be reached only by some half-blazed trail or rutty or sandy road disappearing through darker trees. In the main, the shores of the more remote lakes passed were all but untenanted, or so sparsely that a cabin or a distant lodge to be seen across the smooth waters of some pine-encircled gem was an object of interest to all. Why must he think of that other lake in Massachusetts, that boat, the body of that girl found, but not that of the man who accompanied her? How terrible, really. He recalled afterwards, here in his room, after this last conversation with Roberta, that the car, after a few more miles, had finally swung into an open space at the north end of a long, narrow lake, the south prospect of which appeared to be divided by a point or an island, suggesting a greater length and further windings or curves than were visible from where the car had stopped. And except for the small lodge and boathouse at this upper end, it had appeared so very lonesome. Not a launch or canoe on it at the time their party arrived, and as in the case of all the other lakes seen this day, the banks to the very shoreline were sentinelled with those same green pines, tall, spear-shaped, their arms widespread like one outside his window here in Lycurgus. And beyond them, in the distance, to the south and west, rose the humped and still smooth and green backs of the nearer Adirondacks, and the water before them, now ruffled by a light wind and glowing in the afternoon sun, was of an intense Prussian blue, almost black, which suggested, as was afterwards confirmed by a guide who was lounging upon the low veranda of the small inn, that it was very deep, all of 70 feet, not more than 100 feet out from that boathouse. And at this point Harley Baggett, who was interested to learn more about the fishing possibilities of this lake in behalf of his father, who contemplated coming to this region in a few days, had inquired of the guide, who appeared not to look at the others in the car, "How long is this lake, anyhow?" "Oh, about 7 miles. "Any fish in it?" "Throw a line in and see. The best place for black bass and the like of that almost anywhere around here. Off to the island down yonder, or just to the south of it, round on the other side there, there's a little bay that's said to be one of the best fishing holes in any of the lakes up this way. I've seen a couple of men bring back as many as 75 fish in 2 hours. That ought to satisfy anybody that ain't trying to ruin the place for the rest of us." The guide, a thinnish, tall and wizened type, with a long, narrow head and small, keen, bright blue eyes, laughed a yokelish laugh as he studied the group. "Not thinking of trying your luck today?" "No, just inquiring for my dad. He's coming up here next week, maybe. I want to see about accommodations." "Well, they ain't what they are down to Raquette, of course, but then the fishing down there ain't what they are up here, either." He visited all with a sly and wry and knowing smile. Clyde had never seen the type before. He was interested by all the anomalies and contrarieties of this lonesome world, as contrasted with cities he'd known almost exclusively, as well as the decidedly exotic and material life and equipment with which at the Cranstons and elsewhere he was then surrounded. The strange and comparatively deserted nature of this region as contrasted with the brisk and vigorous life of Lycurgus, less than 100 miles to the south. "The country up here kills me," commented Stuart Finchley at this point. "It's so near the chain, and yet it's so different. Scarcely anyone living up here at all, it seems." "Well, except for the camps in the summer, and the fellows that come up to hunt moose and deer in the fall, there ain't much of anybody or anything around here after September 1st, commented the guide. "I've been guiding and trapping for nigh on to 17 years now around here, and except for more and more people around some of the lakes below here, the chain principally in summer, I ain't seen much change. You need to know this country pretty well if you're going to strike out anywhere away from the main roads, though, of course, about 5 miles to the west of here is the railroad. Gun Lodge is the station. We bring 'em by bus from there in the summer, and from the south end down there is a sort of road leading down to Gray's Lake and 3 Mile Bay. You must have come along a part of it, since it's the only road up to this country as yet. They're talking of cutting one through to Long Lake sometime, but so far it's mostly talk. But for most of these other lakes around here, there's no road at all, not that an automobile could make. Just trails, and there's not even a decent camp on some of them. You have to bring your own outfit. But Ellis and me was over to Gun Lake last summer. That's 30 miles west of here, and we had to walk every inch of the way and carry our packs. But oh, say, the fishing and moose and deer come right down to the shore in places to drink. See 'em as plain as that stump across the lake." And Clyde remembered that, along with the others, he carried away the impression that for solitude and charm, or at least mystery, this region could scarcely be matched. And to think it was also comparatively near like Kirgis, not more than 100 miles by road, not more than 70 by rail, as he eventually came to know. But now once more in Lycurgus, and back in his room after just explaining to Roberta as he had, he once more encountered on his writing desk the identical paper containing the item concerning the tragedy at Pass Lake. And in spite of himself, his eye once more followed nervously and yet unwaveringly, to the last word, all the suggestive and provocative details. The uncomplicated and apparently easy way in which the lost couple had first arrived at the boathouse, the commonplace and entirely unsuspicious way in which they'd hired a boat and set forth for a row, the manner in which they'd disappeared to the north end, and then the upturned boat, the floating oars and hats near the shore. He stood reading in the still strong evening light. Outside the windows were dark boughs of the fir tree of which he thought the preceding day, and which now suggested all those firs and pines about the shores of Big Bittern. But good God, what was he thinking of anyhow? He, Clyde Griffiths, the nephew of Samuel Griffiths. What was getting into him? Murder. That was it. This terrible item, this devil's accident or machination that was constantly putting it before him. A most horrible crime, and one for which they electrocuted people if they were caught. Besides, he could not murder anybody, not Roberta anyhow. Oh, no, surely not after all that had been between them. And yet, this other world, Sandra, which he was certain to lose now unless he acted in some way. His hand shook, his eyelids twitched, then his hair at the roots tingled, and over his body ran chill, nervous titillations in waves. Murder, or upsetting a boat at any rate in deep water, which of course might happen anywhere, and by accident, as at Pass Lake. And Roberta could not swim, he knew that. But she might save herself at that, scream, cling to the boat, and then, if there were any to hear, and she told afterwards. An icy perspiration now sprang to his forehead. His lips trembled, and suddenly his throat felt parched and dry. To prevent a thing like that, he would have to... But no, he was not like that. He could not do a thing like that. Hit anyone, a girl, Roberta, and when drowning or struggling? Oh, no such thing as that. Impossible. He took his straw hat and went out, almost before anyone heard him think, as he would have phrased it to himself, such horrible, terrible thoughts. He could not and would not think them from now on. He was no such person. And yet, these thoughts, the solution if he wanted one, the way to stay here, not leave, marry Sandra, be rid of Roberta and all, for the price of a little courage or daring. But no. He walked and walked away from Lycurgus, out on a road to the southeast which passed through a poor and decidedly unfrequented rural section, and so left him alone to think, or as he felt, not to be heard in his thinking. Day was fading into dark. Lamps were beginning to glow in the cottages here and there. Trees in groups in fields or along the road were beginning to blur or smokily blend, and although it was warm, the air lifeless and lethargic, he walked fast, thinking and perspiring as he did so, as though he were seeking to outwalk and outthink or divert some inner self that preferred to be still and think. That gloomy, lonely lake up there, that island to the south, who would see? Who could hear? That station at Gun Lodge with a bus running to it at this season of the year? Ah, he remembered that, did he? The deuce! A terrible thing, to remember a thing like that in connection with such a thought as this. But if he were going to think of such a thing as this at all, he'd better think well. He could tell himself that, or stop thinking about it now once and forever. Forever. But Sandra, Roberta, if ever he were caught, electrocuted. And yet the actual misery of his present state, the difficulty, the danger of losing Sandra, and yet murder. He wiped his hot and wet face and paused and gazed at a group of trees across a field which somehow reminded him of the trees of, well, he didn't like this road. It was getting too dark out here. He'd better turn and go back. But that road at the south and leading to 3 Mile Bay and Gray's Lake, if one chose to go that way, to Sharon and the Cranston Lodge, whither he would be going afterwards if he did go that way. God! Big Bittern! The trees along there after dark would be like that, blurred and gloomy. It would have to be toward evening, of course. No one would think of trying to, well, in the morning, when there was so much light. Only a fool would do that. But at night, toward dusk, as it was now, or a little later. But damn it, he would not listen to such thoughts. Yet no one would be likely to see him or Roberta either, would they, there? It would be easy to go to a place like Big Bittern for an alleged wedding trip, would it not, over the 4th, say, or after the 4th or 5th, when there would be fewer people, and to register as someone else, not himself, so that he could never be traced that way. And then again, it would be so easy to get back to Sharon and the Cranstons by midnight, or the morning of the next day maybe, and then, once there, he could pretend also that he'd come north on that early morning train that arrived about 10 o'clock. And then, confound it, why should his mind keep dwelling on this idea? Was he actually planning to do a thing like this? But he was not. He could not be. He, Clyde Griffiths, could not be serious about a thing like this. That was not possible. He could not be, of course. It was all too impossible, too wicked, to imagine that he, Clyde Griffiths, could bring himself to execute a deed like that. And yet... And forthwith an uncanny feeling of wretchedness and insufficiency for so dark a crime insisted on thrusting itself forward. He decided to retrace his steps towards Lycurgus, where at least he could be among people. Chapter 45. There are moments when, in connection with the sensitively imaginative or morbidly anachronistic, the mentality assailed in the same knot of any great strength, and the problem confronting it of sufficient force and complexity, the reason not actually toppling from its throne, still totters or is warped or shaken, the mind befuddled to the extent that for the time being, at least, unreason or disorder and mistaken or erroneous counsel would appear to hold against all else. In such instances the will and the courage confronted by some great difficulty, which it can neither master nor endure, appears in some to recede in precipitate flight, leaving only panic and temporary unreason in its wake. And in this instance the mind of Clyde might well have been compared to a small and routed army in full flight before a major one, yet at various times, in its precipitate departure, pausing for a moment to meditate on some way of escaping complete destruction, and in the coincident panic of such a state, resorting to the weirdest and most haphazard of schemes of escaping from an impending and yet wholly unescapable fate. The strained and bedeviled look in his eyes at moments, the manner in which from moment to moment and hour to hour he went over and over his hitherto poorly balanced actions and thoughts, but with no smallest door of escape anywhere, and yet again at moments the solution suggested by the item in the Times Union, again thrusting itself forward, psychogenetically, born of his own turbulent, eager, and disappointed seeking, and hence persisting. Indeed, it was now as though from the depths of some lower or higher world never before guessed or plumbed by him, a region otherwhere than in life or death, and peopled by creatures otherwise than himself, there had now suddenly appeared, as the genii at the accidental rubbing of Aladdin's lamp, as the effort emerging as smoke from the mystic jar in the net of the fisherman, the very substance of some leering and diabolic wish or wisdom concealed in his own nature, and that now abhorrent and yet compelling, leering and yet intriguing, friendly and yet cruel, offered him a choice between an evil which threatened to destroy him, and against his deepest opposition, and a second evil which, however it might disgust or sear or terrify, still provided for freedom and success and love. Indeed, the center or mentating section of his brain at this time might well have been compared to a sealed and silent hole in which alone and undisturbed, and that in spite of himself, he now sat thinking on the mystic or evil and terrifying desires or advice of some darker or primordial and unregenerate nature of his own, and without the power to drive the same forth or himself to decamp, and yet also without the courage to act upon anything. For now the genie of this darkest and weakest side was speaking, and it said, "And would you escape from the demands of Roberta, that but now and unto this hour have appeared unescapable to you? Behold, I bring you away. It is the way of the lake, past lake. This item that you've read, do you think it was placed in your hands for nothing? Remember Big Bittern, the deep blue-black water, the island to the south, the lone road to 3 Mile Bay? How suitable to your needs! A rowboat or a canoe upset in such a lake, and Roberta would pass forever from your life. She cannot swim. The lake, that you've seen, that I've shown you, is it not ideal for the purpose? So removed and so little frequented, and yet comparatively near, but 100 miles from here. And how easy for you and Roberta to go there, not directly but indirectly, on this purely imaginative marriage trip that you've already agreed to. And all that you need do now is to change your name and hers, or let her keep her own and you use yours. You have never permitted her to speak of you and this relationship, and she never has. You've written her but formal notes, and now if you should meet her somewhere, as you've already agreed to, and without anyone seeing you, you might travel with her, as in the past to Fonda, to Big Bittern, or some point near there. But there's no hotel at Big Bittern, at once corrected Clyde, a mere shack that entertains but few people, and that not very well. All the better. The less people are likely to be there. But we might be seen on the train going up together. I would be identified as having been with her. Were you seen at Fonda, Gloversville, Little Falls? Have you not ridden in separate cars or seats before, and could you not do so now? Is it not presumably to be a secret marriage? Then why not a secret honeymoon? True enough. True enough. And once you've arranged for that and arrive at Big Bittern or some lake like it, there are so many there, how easy to row out on such a lake. No questions, no registry under your own name or hers, a boat rented for an hour or a half-day or day. You saw the island far to the south on that lone lake. Is it not beautiful? It's well worth seeing. Why should you not go there on such a pleasure trip before marriage? Would she not be happy so to do? As weary and distressed as she is now? An outing, a rest before the ordeal of the new life? Is not that sensible, plausible? And neither of you will ever return, presumably. You will both be drowned, will you not? Who's to see? A guide or two? The man who rents you the boat? The innkeeper once as you go? But how are they to know who you are, or who she is? And you heard the depth of the water. But I do not want to kill her. I do not want to kill her. I do not want to injure her in any way. If she will but let me go, and she go her own way, I will be so glad and so happy never to see her more. But she will not let you go or go her way unless you accompany her, and if you go yours, it will be without Sandra and all that she represents, as well as all this pleasant life here. You're standing with your uncle, his friends, their cars, the dances, visits to the lodges on the lakes, and what then? A small job, small pay, another such period of wandering as followed that accident at Kansas City. Never another chance like this anywhere. Do you prefer that? But might there not be some accident here, destroying all my dreams, my future, as there was in Kansas City? An accident, to be sure, but not the same. In this instance the plan is in your hands. You can arrange it all as you will, and how easy. So many boats upsetting every summer, the occupants of them drowning, because in most cases they cannot swim. And will it ever be known whether the man who was with Roberta Alden on Big Bittern could swim? And of all deaths, drowning is the easiest. No noise, no outcry, perhaps the accidental blow of an oar, the side of a boat, and then silence, freedom, a body that no one may ever find, or if found and identified, will it not be easy, if you but trouble to plan, to make it appear that you were elsewhere, visiting at one of the other lakes before you decided to go to 12th Lake? What's wrong with it? Where is the flaw? But assuming that I should upset the boat, and that she should not drown, then what? Should cling to it, cry out, be saved, and relate afterward that— But no, I cannot do that. Will not do it. I will not hit her. That would be too terrible, too vile. But a little blow, any little blow under such circumstances would be sufficient to confuse and complete her undoing. Sad, yes, But she has an opportunity to go her own way, has she not? And she will not, nor let you go yours. Well, then, is this so terribly unfair? And do not forget that afterwards there is Sandra, the beautiful, a home with her in Lycurgus, wealth, a high position, such as elsewhere you may never obtain again, never, never. Love and happiness, the equal of anyone here, superior even to your cousin Gilbert. The voice ceased temporarily, trailing off into shadow, silence, dreams, and Clyde, contemplating all that had been said, was still unconvinced. Darker fears or better impulses supplanted the counsel of the voice in the great hall. But presently thinking of Sandra and all that she represented, and then of Roberta, the dark personality would as suddenly and swiftly return, and with amplified suavity and subtlety. Aye, still thinking on the matter. And you've not found a way out, and you will not. I've truly pointed out to you, and in all helpfulness, the only way. The only way. It is a lone lake, and would it not be easy in rowing about to eventually find some secluded spot, some invisible nook near that south shore where the water is deep, and from there how easy to walk through the woods to 3 Mile Bay and Upper Gray's Lake, and from there to the Cranstons. There's a boat from there, as you know. Ah, how cowardly, how lacking in courage to win the thing that above all things you desire, beauty, wealth, position, the solution of your every material and spiritual desire, and with poverty, commonplace, hard and poor work as the alternative to all this. But you must choose, and then act. You must, you must, you must. Thus the voice in parting, echoing from some remote part of the enormous chamber, and Clyde, listening at first with horror and in terror, later with a detached and philosophic calm, as one who, entirely apart from what he may think or do, is still entitled to consider even the wildest and most desperate proposals for his release. At last, because of his own mental and material weakness before pleasures and dreams which he could not bring himself to forego, psychically intrigued to the point where he is beginning to think that it might be possible. Why not? Was it not even, as the voice said, a possible and plausible way? All his desires and dreams to be made real by this one evil thing. Yet in his case, because of flaws and weaknesses in his own unstable and highly variable will, the problem was not to be solved by thinking thus, then, nor for the next 10 days for that matter. He could not really act on such a matter for himself, and would not. It remained as usual for him to be forced either to act or to abandon this most wild and terrible thought. Yet during this time a series of letters, 7 from Roberta, 5 from Sandra, in which in somber tones, insofar as Roberta was concerned, in gay and colourful ones in those which came from Sandra, was painted the now so sharply contrasting phases of the black rebus which lay before him. To Roberta's pleadings, argumentative and threatening as they were, Clyde did not trust himself to reply, not even by telephone, for now he reasoned that to answer would be only to lure Roberta to her doom, or to the attempted drastic conclusion of his difficulties as outlined by the tragedy at Pass Lake. At the same time, in several notes addressed to Sandra, he gave vent to the most impassioned declarations of love. His darling, his wonder girl, how eager he was to be at 12th Lake by the morning of the 4th if he could, and so thrilled to see her there again. Yet, alas, as he also wrote now, so uncertain was he even now as to how he was to do. There were certain details in connection with his work here that might delay him a day or 2 or 3, he could not tell as yet, but would write her by the 2nd at the latest, when he would know positively. Yet saying to himself as he wrote this, if she but knew what those details were, if she but knew. Yet in penning this, and without having as yet answered the last importunate letter from Roberta, he was also saying to himself that this did not mean that he was planning to go to Roberta at all, or that if he did, it did not mean that he was going to attempt to kill her. Never once did he honestly, or to put it more accurately, forthrightly and courageously or coldly, face the thought of committing so grim a crime. On the contrary, the nearer he approached to final resolution, or the need for one in connection with all this, the more hideous and terrible seemed the idea, hideous and difficult, and hence the more improbable it seemed that he should ever commit it. It was true that from moment to moment, arguing with himself as he constantly was, sweating mental sweats and fleeing from moral and social terrors in connection with it all. He was thinking from time to time that he might go to Big Bittern in order to quiet her in connection with these present importunities and threats, and hence, once more evasion, tergiversation with himself, give himself more time in which to conclude what his true course must be. The way of the lake. The way of the lake. But once there, whether it would then be advisable so to do or not, well, who could tell? He might even yet be able to convert Roberta to some other point of view. Or say what you would, she was certainly acting very unfairly and captiously in all this. She was, as he saw it in connection with his very vital dream of Sandra, making a mountain, an immense terror, out of a state that, when all was said and done, was not so different from Esther's. And Esther had not compelled anyone to marry her. And how much better were the Aldens to his own parents, poor farmers as compared to poor preachers? And why should he be so concerned as to what they would think when Esther had not troubled to think what her parents would feel? In spite of all that Roberta had said about blame, was she so entirely lacking in blame herself? To be sure, he had sought to entice or seduce her, as you will, but even so, could she be held entirely blameless? Could she not have refused, if she was so positive at the time that she was so very moral? But she'd not. And as to all this, all that he had he not done all he could to help her out of it? And he had so little money, too, and was placed in such a difficult position. She was just as much to blame as he was, and yet now she was so determined to drive him this way, to insist on his marrying her, whereas if she would only go her own way, as she could with his help, she might still save both of them all this trouble. But no, she would not, and he would not marry her, and that was all there was to it. She need not think that she could make him. No, no, no. At times, when in such moods he felt that he could do anything, drown her easily enough, and she would only have herself to blame. Then again, his more cowering sense of what society would think and do if it knew what he himself would be compelled to think of himself afterwards, fairly well satisfied him that as much as he desired to stay, he was not the one to do anything at all, and in consequence must flee. And so it was that Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday following Roberta's letter received on Monday had passed, and then on Thursday night, following a most torturesome mental day on his and Roberta's part for that matter, this is what he received. Bouts, Wednesday, June 30th. Dear Clyde, this is to tell you that unless I hear from you either by telephone or letter before noon Friday, I shall be in Lycurgus that same night, and the world would know how you've treated me. I cannot and will not wait and suffer one more hour. I regret to be compelled to take this step, but you've allowed all this time to go in silence, really, and Saturday is the 3rd, and without any plans of any kind. My whole life is ruined, and so will yours be in a measure, but I cannot feel that I'm entirely to blame. I've done all I possibly could to make this burden as easy for you as possible, and I certainly regret all the misery it will cause my parents and friends, and all whom you know and hold dear. But I will not wait and suffer 1 hour more. Roberta. And with this in his hands, he was finally all but numbed by the fact that now decidedly he must act. She was actually coming. Unless he could soothe or restrain her in some manner, she would be here tomorrow, the 2nd. And yet the 2nd or the 3rd, or any time until after the 4th, was no time to leave with her. The holiday crowds would be too great. There would be too many people to see, to encounter. There must be more secrecy. He must have at least a little more time in which to get ready. He must think now quickly and then act. Great God! Get ready. Could he not telephone her and say that he'd been sick or so worried on account of the necessary money, or something, that he could not write? And that besides his uncle had sent for him to come to Greenwood Lake over the 4th? His uncle. His uncle. No, that would not do. He'd used his name too much. What difference should it make to him or her now, whether he saw his uncle once more or not? He was leaving once and for all, or so he had been telling her, on her account, was he not? And so he'd better say that he was going to his uncle, in order to give a reason why he was going away, so that possibly he might be able to return in a year or so. She might believe that. At any rate, he must tell her something that would quiet her until after the 4th. Make her stay up there until at least he could perfect some plan, bring himself to the place where he could do one thing or the other. One thing or the other. Without pausing to plan anything more than just this at this time, he hurried to the nearest telephone, where he was least likely to be overheard, and getting her once more, began one of those long and evasive, and in this instance ingratiating explanations which eventually, after he had insisted that he'd actually been sick, confined to his room with a fever, and hence not able to get to a telephone, and because, as he now said, he'd finally decided that it would be best if he were to make some explanation to his uncle, so that he might return sometime in the future if necessary, he, by using the most pleading, if not actually affectionate tones, and asking her to consider what state he'd been in, too, was able not only to make her believe that there was some excuse for his delay and silence, but also to introduce the plan that he now had in mind, which was, if only she could wait until the 6th, then assuredly, without fail as to any particular, he would meet her at any place she would choose to come. Homer, Fonda, Lycurgus, Little Falls. Only since they're trying to keep everything so secret, he would suggest that she come to Fonda on the morning of the 6th in order to make the noon train for Utica. There they could spend the night, since they could not very well discuss and decide on their plans over the telephone now, and then they could act upon whatever they had decided. Besides, he could tell her better then just how he thought they ought to do. He had an idea, a little trip maybe, somewhere before they got married or after, just as she wished, but something nice anyhow. His voice grew husky, and his knees and hands shook slightly as he said this. Only Roberta could not detect the sudden perturbation within him. But she must not ask him now. He could not tell her over the phone. Be as sure as anything, at noon on the 6th, he would be on the station platform at Fonda. All she had to do after seeing him was to buy her ticket to Utica and get in one coach, and he would buy his separately and get in another, the one just ahead or behind hers. On the way down, if she didn't see him at the station beforehand, he would pass through her car for a drink so that she could see that he was there. No more than that. But she mustn't speak to him. Then, once in Utica, she should check her bag, and he would follow her out to the nearest quiet corner. After that he would go and get her bag, and then they could go to some little hotel, and he would take care of all the rest. But she must do this. Would she have that much faith in him? If so, he would call her up on the 3rd, the very next day, and on the morning of the 6th, sure, so that both he and she would know that everything was all right, that she was starting, and that he would be there. What was that? Her trunk? The little one? Sure, if she needed it, certainly bring it. Only if he were she, he would not trouble to try to bring too much now, because once she was settled somewhere, it would be easy enough to send for anything else that she really needed. As Clyde stood at the telephone in a small outlying drugstore and talked, the lonely proprietor buried in a silly romance among his pots and files at the back, it seemed as though the giant effort that had previously materialized in the silent halls of his brain was once more here at his elbow, that he himself, cold and numb and fearsome, was being talked through, not actually talking himself. Go to the lake which you visited with Sandra? Get travel folders of the region there from either the Lycurgus house here or the depot? Go to the south end of it, and from there walk south afterwards. Pick a boat that will upset easily, one with a round bottom, such as those you've seen here at Plum Lake and up there. Buy a new and different hat and leave that on the water, one that cannot be traced to you. You might even tear the lining out of it so that it cannot be traced. Pack all your things in your trunk here, but leave it so that swiftly, in the event that anything goes wrong, you can return here and get it and depart. And take only such things with you as will make it seem as though you were going for an outing to 12th Lake, not away, so that you should be sought at 12th Lake. It will look as though you'd gone only there, not elsewhere. Tell her that you intend to marry her, but after your return from this outing, not before. And if necessary, strike a light blow so as to stun her, no more, so that falling in the water she will drown the more easily. Do not fear. Do not be weak. Walk through the woods by night, not by day, so that when seen again you will be in the 3 Mile Bay or Sharon, and say that you came from Raquette or Long Lake South or from Lycurgus North. Use a false name, and alter your handwriting as much as possible. Assume that you will be successful, and whisper, whisper. Let your language be soft, your tone tender, loving even. It must be, if you are to win her to your will now. show the effort of his own darker self. This concludes Part 1 of An American Tragedy. This book is continued on Cassette 1, Part 2. Please fast forward to the end of this tape.